seats.
Okay. Can I ask you to please take your seats? Good morning, everyone. My name's Jim Ryan, and I'm the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you to By All Means, Redesigning Education to Restore Opportunity. I want to especially welcome those who traveled a great distance to be here. Today is the first of 5 convenings over the next 2.5 years. We have a number of special guests that I'd like to recognize and welcome, beginning with the mayors and city officials from the 6 selected cities participating in the By All Means project. They come from Oakland, California, Louisville, Kentucky. You can whoop and holler if you'd like. Providence, Rhode Island. Oh, how quiet. Salem, Massachusetts. Newton, Massachusetts, and Somerville. All right, a crowd to beat. We'll get a chance to hear directly from the mayors about the education redesign efforts in their cities a little later in this morning in a panel I'll moderate. I'm also delighted to welcome leaders from a number of local and national education organizations, including teachers, principals, district leaders, early education leaders, leaders from education nonprofit and advocacy organizations, leaders from education philanthropies, Harvard faculty, as well as faculty from local colleges and universities, HGSE students, education journalists, and members of the media and business leaders. I hope you will have a chance to meet with one another and exchange ideas throughout the day. I also want to welcome Harvard President Drew Gilpin-Faust and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. And last but not least, welcome to all those watching online. Today's event is being live streamed on the HGSE website. So I'd like to begin by thanking a few people and then talk a little bit about today's convening and then introduce President Faust. First and foremost, I want to extend thanks to Paul Revel, the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Education Policy and Administration here at HGSE, and the founding director of the Education Redesign Lab. It is really Paul's vision of an education system that works for all students that brings us here today. I also want to thank his team, Bridget Rodriguez, Lynn Sachs, and Dan Scarver, along with Mimi Gerbst and Carrie Cook, who provided invaluable advice along the way and put together what I think is a terrific series of panelists and a phenomenal group of panelists. I want to thank our team in programs in professional education, especially Caitlin Kennedy and Mideline Fletcher, as well as their staff volunteers who are all here today. And last, but by no means least, I want to acknowledge and thank the generous supporters of this event, Fritz Hobbs and Nick Donahue, who is the president of the Nellie Mae Foundation, along with New Profit. Both Fritz and Nick are here today. I also want to thank Linda Hammett-Orey and her husband Andy Orey for their generous support of the Education Redesign Lab. So, as I mentioned, we're here to kick off the By All Means project, which is a bold and ambitious plan to address the challenges of poverty and education head-on by working both on the national level with a series of 5 convenings and at the local level with city officials and community members. It is addressing one of the most fundamental questions in education and the question that drew me personally into education, namely, how do we create an education system that works for all kids? I say this is a question that brought me into education because I was someone for whom the system worked. Neither of my parents went to college. I grew up in a blue-collar suburb in New Jersey, went to public schools my whole life, and when I got to college, a small college in Connecticut that I'm not allowed to actually name in the presence of President Faust, it totally changed my life, and I began thinking then, why did the system work for me when it fails so many others? And that's the question that motivates this convening, but beyond simply trying to understand the question, the point of these convenings is to try to do something about it. As President Obama has said, It's a fundamentally American ideal that every child, regardless of race, gender, background, or zip code, deserves the chance to make out of their lives what they want. But as we know, reality falls far short of this ideal. The disparity of educational opportunities between wealthy and poor students means that far too few students receive a high-quality education, and far too few are able to reach their potential. Education at the moment is far from fulfilling its promise of social mobility for children in poverty. And this is where the By All Means project comes in. The goal is twofold. First, to invigorate a public conversation among business, school, and community leaders, along with teachers, students, and families, about what it would truly take to make examples of success the rule and not the exception for students in poverty. We're going to do this through a series of 5 convenings over the next 2.5 years, each one on a different topic, to draw attention and to discuss the ways we can build a system of education that truly serves all students. I hope and expect that these convenings will raise provocative questions and stimulate debate and action around the topic of poverty and education. As Fritz Hobbs and I discussed in talking about these convenings, and as he pointed out, not unless a few people get mad during the day will we be getting to the heart of the issue. So I expect some of you at one point or another during the day will get a little mad. The second goal is to connect entrepreneurial and committed city mayors, superintendents, and city officials directly with one another and with faculty from HGSE in order to create and lead children's cabinets composed of superintendents, heads of health and social services, recreation, cultural, and arts activists, and other key community leaders. Working together and with the Education Redesign Lab, these cabinets will spend tomorrow brainstorming and designing new strategies for meeting the needs of all children in their communities. These strategies will include ways to ensure that reform efforts are inclusive of students and families themselves. These cities, importantly, will also serve as lab sites for promising redesign efforts so that the ideas developed and refined at the workshops can be tested in real-world contexts and that successful efforts can provide models for other cities to learn from and emulate. The topic of today's session will focus on how we can level the playing field for students from all socioeconomic backgrounds and what schools, with the support of their communities, can do. We'll begin by hearing from 2 champions of education and equality in the state of Massachusetts, Harvard President Drew Faust and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. I will say a few words of introduction about Drew, who will then in turn introduce Governor Patrick. He in turn will say a few words about me, and we'll continue talking about one another until you're tired. So Drew Faust is the 28th president of Harvard University and the Lincoln Professor of History in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Prior to being named president in 2007, she was the founding dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, having served before that as a history professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where she earned 2 awards for distinguished teaching. She is an accomplished Civil War scholar and the author of 6 books, including the award-winning This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War, which was named by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of 2008. As president of Harvard, Drew has made financial aid a top priority, ensuring that all admitted students are able to attend Harvard College regardless of their ability to pay. She has also strongly supported teaching and learning at the university, launching the Harvard Initiative for Learning and Teaching, edX, and HarvardX. And near and dear to our heart here at HGSE, she has demonstrated a deep commitment to education through her strong support of the Harvard Teacher Fellows Program, a new career pathway to teaching for Harvard.
Watch this effort and share about achievement gaps that lead the lives of America's children up to chance, their possibilities too often preordained at birth. And we know, because of remarkable research done here at Harvard and elsewhere, that we have the opportunity to lift a generation of children out of cycles of poverty. We together can create the education and the support systems that they deserve. We must all speak a simple truth more frequently and more forcefully. Achievement gaps affront the ideals of our democracy. The United States has long linked its national identity to the power of education. In 1779, for example, Thomas Jefferson called for a national aristocracy of talent, chosen, as he put it, without regard to wealth, birth, or other accidental condition or circumstance, and rendered by liberal education able to guard the sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of their fellow citizens. Another favorite statement from American history that I quote very often comes from the early 20th century across the country. Cambridge, in Somerville, in Salem, in Providence, in Louisville, in Oakland, in Newton. Ours is, I hope I didn't forget anyone. Did I forget anyone in that list? Got them all. Good. Ours is a larger, more diverse, more inclusive America than Thomas Jefferson ever could have imagined. One that became so in no small part due to the efforts of people like Nannie Helen Burroughs. But the promise of education remains before us. I thank all of you for being here to undertake that work that can change individual lives and shape the future that we all share together. Now, I can imagine nobody who better embodies that aim than today's keynote speaker, the Honorable Deval Patrick. From January 2007 through January 2015, he served with distinction as the 71st Governor of Massachusetts, driving efforts to spur innovation, create economic opportunity, advance equality, promote clean energy, and to promote the life sciences. In 2014, he was awarded the National Education Association's Greatest Education Governor Award. I wonder if that came with like a big rosette or something that you could wear saying Greatest Education Governor. Just to recognize the kinds of inspiring leadership he had provided on these very important issues. These accomplishments are all the more impressive because of Governor Patrick's beginnings. Raised, as he has put it, and I quote him, in a broken home and in poverty on Chicago's South Side, he attended Milton Academy in Massachusetts with the support of A Better Chance. He went on to graduate from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and he led a very distinguished legal career prior to his election as Massachusetts governor. When he gave the commencement address at Harvard last spring, a year ago next week in fact, he called for, and I quote him again, unrest in our hearts and minds. And he challenged those assembled, as he memorably put it, to act big, to bring their intelligence, their ideas, their energy, and their commitment to bear on society's greatest challenges. He said, I want us to ask ourselves hard questions and to start asking our leaders hard questions about the state of the American dream. I want us to be uneasy because if enough of us are uneasy, we might begin to feel some urgency about finding solutions to the things that make us so. We gather here today to be uneasy together and to search for the outcomes that kind of uneasiness and questioning can bring. Please join me in welcoming a self-described idealist who has led an improbable, an extraordinary, and an uneasy life, Deval Patrick.
Thank you. I have this thing on an iPad. There we go. Thank you, President Drew, thank you so much for the generous introduction and for your kindnesses over the years, and most especially for your exceptional leadership of this university through challenging times. To Dean Ryan and Professor Revel, thank you for convening this important gathering of thought leaders and education practitioners, and for inviting me to join you. I told you both when you asked me that I was out of the speech-giving business. It's a testament to your persistence and also to how important I feel these subjects are that I am here nonetheless. To all of the mayors and superintendents and educators and other distinguished guests here this morning, thank you for caring about this work and for doing so much to make our schools better. You are, of course, in the right place at the right time, particularly to address today's subject matter. Our Commonwealth is home of America's first free public school, America's first college, America's first college for women, America's first school for the sight impaired. For centuries, we have been a leader in education because our forebears appreciated that education was about advancing civilization and securing our future. They wrote that fundamental value into our Constitution. Indeed, judging from several trade missions during our time in office, I can confidently report that education is the Commonwealth's calling card to the world. It's also central to our economic and social strength. Any number of studies confirm that better educated citizens contribute more and cost less than less educated ones. One study out of Northeastern a few years ago indicated that in Massachusetts, individuals with bachelor's degrees strengthened the state's economy by over $800,000 over the course of an average working life, as compared to high school dropouts who cost us around $200,000 over the same period. 800,000 in versus 200,000 out. Meanwhile, a staggering number of kids in some of our nation's public high schools drop out before they graduate, a large proportion of whom are poor, minority, or both. While that number has dropped in Massachusetts in recent years, it's still too high, especially when you consider that dropouts represent 75% of prison population and 69% of jail inmates in this country. Education, as the President has said, and as you all know, is also central to our national narrative. The American dream depends on opportunity, and opportunity depends on education. I suspect that story is true for many of you. It's certainly true for me, and with apologies to the folks from Massachusetts who can repeat what I'm about to say verbatim, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own story. Some of you will know, of course, that I grew up on the south side of Chicago, much of that time on welfare. I lived there with my mother and my sister and my grandparents. Who's here from Louisville, by the way? Those grandparents were from Louisville, by the way. In our grandparents' two-bedroom tenement. My sister and mother and I shared one of those bedrooms and a set of bunk beds, so you'd rotate from the top bunk to the bottom bunk to the floor every third night on the floor. I went to big, overcrowded, under-resourced, sometimes violent public schools. I can't remember a time when I didn't love to read, but I don't remember owning a book of my own until I was 14 years old and got my big break through a program called A Better Chance to attend Milton Academy here in Massachusetts. For me, arriving the night before classes began alone and sight unseen was like landing on a different planet. Now, my children's upbringing has been strikingly different. They grew up in a large house in a leafy neighborhood outside of Boston. They've always had their own rooms. By the time they got to high school, they had read extensively, had traveled on 3 continents, knew how to use and pronounce a concierge, and had shaken hands in the White House with the President of the United States. When our Catherine was 5 years old, her kindergarten class was studying the differences in the seasons, summer, fall, winter, spring. Her homework assignment one evening was to describe the 4 seasons to Mom and Dad. So Catherine came home and in complete and accurate detail described her several visits to the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C. First you drive up and the doorman takes your car, she said. 5 years old. One generation. Do you understand? One generation, and the circumstances of my life and my family were completely transformed. Now, that story doesn't get told as often as we'd like in this country, but it gets told more often in this country than any other place on earth. That is an American story. And education is the foundation of that story. 23 years ago, with the passage of the Education Reform Act, we here in Massachusetts embarked on a journey to improve the public schools. The state committed to smooth out the funding differential between wealthy and poor school districts in exchange for more stringent proficiency standards. In essence, this was a high-stakes, high-expectations approach, and it enjoyed the support and advocacy of educators, parents, business and municipal leaders, and policymakers alike. And the results have been impressive. Over the last several years, Massachusetts students rank first in the nation on the NAEPS achievement tests and at or near the top in the world in math and science on the TIMSS assessment. As parents, as teachers, as policymakers, and as a community, we are proud of these extraordinary outcomes. Indeed, because I believe that children can't wait out their childhood for conditions to be just right for parents to act, our administration funded the public schools at the highest levels in history, even during the Great Recession when the bottom was falling out of the rest of the state budget. And yet, achievement gaps persist. And stuck in those gaps are poor children, children with special needs, children who speak English as a second language, more often children of color. For the reasons I've cited and those you know well, achievement gaps are an educational and an economic problem. But to let them languish for as long as we have, that's a moral question. Because these are our children too. And they are just as hungry for knowledge and opportunity as any other. So when Professor Revel was Secretary of Education Revel, we moved an Achievement Gap Act through our legislature here in Massachusetts. It provides new rules, new tools, and new supports to enable teachers to do whatever is necessary to ignite a love of learning in every child. Looking back, it was an extraordinary thing in these times that so many competing interests came together to hammer out a piece of practical legislation. It seems almost quaint to think that that sort of thing actually happened in our lifetimes. And many, many here were a part of making it so. It has made a difference. And that experience and others may permit me to offer some insights, some observations, and perhaps some cautions as you embark on the work that remains, namely, to reach the talent we know resides in every community by all means necessary. So first, some insights. Number one, the pace of change is accelerating. Everybody says that. To be honest, I'm not convinced that's objectively true, as times are always changing. But I acknowledge that it feels like change is faster because information is ubiquitous, and we are better informed about change more broadly than ever. The more information there is about change, the more likely it is that change touches more people, and the greater the challenge we all face just to keep up. Number two, the American dream is at risk. We all know the data about job stagnation, about the declining trends in home ownership and savings, about how it takes a two-income household to provide the wherewithal that a single income once did, about the widespread expectations that today's young college graduates will not lead better lives than their parents. Income inequality is the term in fashion, but to me that doesn't really describe what we're facing. We have always had rich and poor. I would suggest that economic mobility is the true challenge. Indeed, we have aspired through generations to enable Americans not to have their lives defined by the zip code of their birth, to reach beyond their grasp. Throughout these times, education has been critical to economic mobility. If education systems fail us, the American dream is in jeopardy. The third insight I would offer has to do with how we think about the purpose of education today. To me, this derives from the first two insights. I believe there is more to education than preparing future employees. That democracy itself, as the president's quote of that marvelous civil rights leader so well captured, depends on an educated citizenry. But whether you fall on the economic side or the social side of that spectrum of purpose, it's clear that we need people and communities who can adapt to the pace of rapid change we experience, indeed who can shape it. To me, that suggests an education system designed to produce curious, confident learners for life. By curious, I mean learners who are interested to understand not just what, but how, and especially why. Learners who are instructed and judged not merely by rote, but by disciplines of mind and approaches to problem solving. By confident, I mean learners who through experience become undaunted by the new. We need citizens who embrace new circumstances and trends with the self-awareness and self-confidence to believe with real conviction that they can figure it out. And by life learners, I mean those who, through experience from pre-K up to and including workforce training and development, see education as unbound by the traditional school, who take personal responsibility for their own education throughout their lives. In other words, we need to see, to think about, and to work on education as something beyond the four walls of a school building or the hours of a school day, but rather as a set of tools to adapt to and flourish in the midst of change and to advance civilization itself. That won't happen unless you start your work with these outcomes in mind, and I encourage you to do so. And it won't happen for enough of our children until you resolve to educate the whole child. It's well past time to broaden our purview to embrace and address all the circumstances in which a child develops such skills. No child learns well when hungry or sleepy or afraid. Once we could depend on a child's family or community to look after all that, and in many circumstances we still do and should. I often talk about how on the south side of Chicago in the 50s and the 60s, when I was growing up, each child was under the jurisdiction of every single adult on the block. If you messed up down the street in front of Ms. Jones, she'd go upside your head as if you were hers and then call home. So you got it 2 times. That was a time when whole neighborhoods took responsibility for raising the kids. Today, we often ask schools to do what whole neighborhoods used to. And the sooner we start enabling and equipping schools to provide what communities used to, the further along we will get in developing a world-class education for all children. Against those insights, let me offer 3 related observations. The first, notwithstanding my comment about the good old days in the 50s and 60s, beware of nostalgia. In my experience, the single most powerful policy influence in education is nostalgia. So many advocates from so many different perspectives work so hard in furtherance of a vision rooted in some better, simpler time. The obvious truth is that the world is not the same as it once was, so yesterday's solutions may not make sense today. The related truth of which to be mindful is that the good old days were not so good for everybody. Yesterday's segregated schools, yesterday's stay-at-home mothers, some of whom who stayed at home because they had no other option, yesterday's bullied students with disabilities, or closeted gay and lesbian students. These and other features of yesterday's mythologized schools have no place in today's classrooms, preparing young people for tomorrow's diverse, complex world. The second observation I would make is to beware of certainty. I've met union leaders who were certain that yielding any authority for hiring, firing, or discipline to a principal was the end of collective bargaining rights. And to charter advocates who were certain that district schools were by definition failures. I've met business leaders who were certain that the central purpose of community colleges, if not all schools, should be to prepare the future workforce. And community college leaders who were certain that asking their institutions to help close the skills gap in regional economies was the death of their mission. Everybody needs to bring a little more humility to this work. Nobody has a corner on all of the best ideas. And if we really want innovation in public education, then all of the interested parties must make room in their own thinking, if not in their own doctrines, for others' experiences in success. Because the truth of the matter is that in a nation of 300 million, not all learners learn in the same way. And we must have systems that meet children and adult learners alike where they are. Finally, and at the risk of stirring some controversy, we should confront the old, unresolved jurisdictional debate about who, if you will, owns education reform. Just whose business is this anyway? Education has traditionally been the province of local or state authority, and there's a lot to like about that tradition. Local communities are closer to their citizens and usually better able to understand what works and what doesn't in and for the community served. That's one reason why politicians get so agitated when the federal government gets involved. Of course, let's not forget that some of that agitation has historically been about race. Left to the states, black and brown students received subpar education resources and opportunity. The federal government involved itself to right that wrong, and let's not lose sight of that. But beyond that, I submit that we have a national interest in a well-educated population. That interest bears directly on our economic competitiveness and social stability and security. And I promise you that China and India and Pakistan and most of Western Europe, for that matter, each of our competitor nations understands the importance of education to their future prosperity and security, and none are relegating education policy exclusively to towns, provinces, or individual states. Federal-state tension inflames and subsides throughout American political history, and I understand that. And I'm not expressing a view on whether the Federal Department of Education always gets it right. But in a world experiencing a knowledge explosion, where we need the talent we know resides in every community on the field and ready to play, it does not serve us well as a nation to let education gaps persist anywhere, because doing so is a so-called states' right. As you work through to a vision and a set of policy choices, I hope you will do so, as I said, with humility. I hope you will listen to others, particularly those who differ from you. I think the president quoted Fritz as saying, "You haven't made progress today unless somebody's mad." I want to quote in relation to that Louis Pasteur, who said that being educated is learning to listen to anyone without losing your temper or your self-confidence. Each of you is an expert. Each of you has a depth of experience and data that I could not possibly match. But I can tell you, as a former policymaker and advocate, and as a parent and a grandparent, that each child is unique, and that whatever the differences in background or circumstances, children are hungry to learn. Your job is to find the right blend of circumstances that enable all collectively and each individually to do so. One of the features of public office is that you get formally introduced a lot, in the course of which your personal story is often distilled and summarized. I was thinking, Jim, it is so true. In this old job I had, the person who was introducing me was introduced, and then I get introduced, and it would be just a marvelous twist to say, and now I'm going to go back and introduce the person who introduced the person who introduced me. I have noticed how often I'm introduced as if my life and opportunities began at the age of 14 at Milton Academy. With 10 students in the classroom, the most up-to-date facilities, a well-stocked library, and a legacy of achievement over 200 years before I got there, I am very keenly aware, Todd, of how much Milton Academy contributed to the arc of my own life, and I don't question that. But I've always felt that those introductions, however generous and well-intended, overlook the importance of my teachers back on the south side of Chicago. I remember one in particular, Mrs. Quaintance, in the 6th grade. There were 35 or 40 of us in that classroom, every one of us from broken circumstances and broken households. And yet Mrs. Quaintance taught us to count and say the greetings in German. She took us to the first opera I'd ever been to. I had no idea what they were singing about. I still don't know what they're singing about, but I loved it then and I do now. She took us to a new movie out at the time called The Sound of Music and used it to expose us to the rise of the Nazis and World War II history. She was the first person to help us imagine what it might be like to be a citizen of the world. I sensed then, but I know now, what a huge gift that was. That teacher was important to me. She was present when I graduated from Milton Academy, when I graduated from Harvard College, when I graduated from Harvard Law School, when I was married, when I was sworn into my position in the Justice Department. She would have been present at my inauguration had she survived. My third grade teacher was here, by the way. My point is that while every child needs something different or some combination of things unique to his or her own circumstance, every child needs in common an engaged, well-prepared, well-supported teacher in front of them who loves them, loves teaching, and has the latitude and authority to do what is necessary to teach his or her students how to love learning. Above all, I hope you'll bear that in mind as you work toward solutions that, by all means, lift every child. I wish each of you the best and pray for the success of your critical work. Thank you very much for having me.
When I was Secretary of Education, I always had the advantage of being able to introduce Deval Patrick, and I avoided the calamity of following him to the podium. I haven't been so lucky today, but thank you, Deval, for leading us off with just the right tone. I want to thank President Faust and Dean Ryan for your consistent support of this effort, Fritz Hobbs for making all of this possible, and so many in the room who will address later on today who have supported our work and have come together with us today for this important conversation. I'm Paul Revel. I'm proud to be a faculty member here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I am proud to be the founding director of the Education Redesign Lab and to be responsible with my colleagues for bringing you together today for what is a really important conversation about a subject that we often avoid talking about, and about our vision for where we're headed in the 21st century and how we intend to fulfill our ideals of excellence and equity that we've not thus far in our education reform efforts been able to bring to all of our students. And having you here for this conversation, having especially our teams from the 6 cities who've committed to this work, mayors, superintendents, and other leaders in those communities to come forward, I think is a momentous occasion. And I'm so gratified. This is the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, really, to have this kind of conversation at the beginning of the 21st century about where we are headed and why we need to go there. Is very gratifying to me. So I'm very appreciative for all of you being here. My role in the next few minutes is to kind of make the case for why we're here. Many of you have heard this, many of you live this, many of you advocate for this in your own line of work, but making the case for why we need to address these issues that are so critical, the issues of equity, the issues of, in spite of our best efforts, one of the messages that Deval Patrick and I always used to put forward here in Massachusetts, where we lead the nation in education performance, was doing well isn't good enough, that despite our best efforts, we still have these deep, persistent achievement gaps. What do they look like? What do we make of them when we look at them head on? And what are we, most importantly, going to do about them as we go forward? So that's what I want to do in the next few minutes with the help of a little PowerPoint. Let's see if it works here. And there we go. So I'm going to step to the side here. Can you hear me? Okay. This is a conversation about poverty and the relationship to schooling that, frankly, in our field, too often we've chosen to ignore or to avoid. We've turned a blind eye. We don't like to talk about it so much. We're worried that if we talk about poverty, people might think we're stereotyping, that we're making conclusions about groups of people, when in fact, of course, we're not talking about any individual person, but we are talking about what the data show us as a whole. And the data, as you'll soon see, and as you know in your own experience, is pretty clear. We're afraid to acknowledge at some level that demographics in this country still predict destiny, even though the myth, where we live and what we want to believe, is that we live in an equal opportunity society, we live in a meritocracy, anything's possible. And for individuals, as we've just seen in Deval Patrick's case and so many other folks in this room, that is the case. But overall, the data don't lie, they tell a story. It isn't about a deficit model, it's about acknowledging that there are impacts associated with poverty that have a regular and profound effect on people's life chances. We don't want to have this conversation sometimes because we're worried that it diminishes the value and importance of schooling. But to the contrary, it's why we're here at a School of Education talking about these topics. It's why we see schools as central to the solution to these challenges that we've not yet fully addressed. We're afraid in this conversation of overwhelming educators. Any of you who live in schools or work in schools or visit schools regularly will know that school people feel overloaded as things currently are. And to add on to school folks the added burden of doing something about the complex problems associated with poverty often seems like too much. So in fact, as we devise solutions, as we build systems to address these challenges, they have to go beyond schools and school people to include whole communities and all the kinds of people who are represented in this room today. But the clear reality that we have to face head on is that despite our best efforts at education reform, despite all the work that we did here in Massachusetts, where we invested deeply, where we were persistent, where we worked hard, after 20 years, there's still an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. That's the reality. We set out, as Deval said, to eliminate that correlation between zip code and educational achievement, and yet we have failed on that score to achieve that goal. Folks have been working hard on this subject in this country for a long time. Elaine Weiss is here today. I'm privileged to be a co-chair of the Bolder Broader initiative nationally that is restarting. Having done a lot of good work on this over the past decade, there's an article included in your packet entitled "Student Poverty Isn't an Excuse, It's a Barrier." And looking at that barrier head on and figuring out what we can do about it, that's the work of By All Means. So there continue to be disparate outcomes at all levels in the system. And I'm just going to, with apologies, barrage you with some of the data with which you're all familiar, but I want us to look it square in the face because that's the premise on which this conversation is based. Okay, here's a table about unequal outcomes by race, ethnicity, and parents' education level. And you'll see mathematics and reading scores. You'll see levels of proficiency for different subgroups divided by race and ethnicity above, male and female. And then down at the bottom, you'll see the highest level of parental education. So the parents' education being a key predictor of your success in the education system. Here are unequal outcomes if we look at disability and language barriers. We're putting this up because we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about poverty and economic disadvantage, but we know there are gaps along a lot of other lines, and we want to make clear that we acknowledge those, and that those are important to our conversation. Here's a great table many of you may have seen that appeared in the New York Times just recently. It's actually an interactive table, so if you get a chance, I would look this up. Every dot there represents a school system in the United States, and you can touch the dot and look at its level of achievement. And you see a straight line, northeastern moving line of the correlation between the income of the community and the achievement levels. However, it's important to know as you look vertically, within each line that you might draw vertically, there are high achieving schools and low achieving schools, which make the case that schools do matter. Schools are a powerful influence, the most powerful influence outside of family on the lives of children. But in general, the income level in the community in which you happen to grow up is a pretty good predictor of where you're going to land. The likelihood of being ready for school at age 5 by poverty status at birth. 4th grade NAEP scores. So the blue bar is if you're school lunch eligible, and these are levels of, these are scores actually, not levels of proficiency. The orange bar is if you're not eligible. So significant score differences there. 8th grade NAEP scales math scores by economic status. Again, blue bar is eligible for free lunch, orange bar is not. Here is the average SAT scores scaled by income. You see the same straight northeastern line. Here's the high school dropout rate. 5 times different. Here's the high school graduation rate by income. Here's a percentage of students attending a community college as their first college. Here's a percentage of students enrolled in a 4-year college requiring remedial coursework. Much higher for low-income students. Here's the percentage of students entering and completing college by their income level. Here's the relationship, and it's never been stronger, between how educated you are and how much you earn. So education has become more important than ever before in our society, and the correlation between education and income is as strong as it's ever been. And it doesn't stop with just earnings, it goes to life expectancy as well. Here's a table showing that the higher your income, the longer you're likely to live. So behind the unequal outcomes is an opportunity gap. You know, we talk about achievement gaps, so we've just seen a lot of achievement gaps, but behind those are the opportunity gaps, different sorts of opportunities that young people face. So we're going to talk more later today about adverse childhood experiences that induce toxic stress in the lives of children. So the orange line is those at 200% or lower of the free and reduced income level, and those in the blue line are 400% of that income level or higher. So you see the number of toxic stress inducing incidents in children's lives. The percentage of children aged 3 to 6 in center-based daycare. The green line is advantaged students, the blue line is disadvantaged students. Many of you are familiar with the Hart and Risley work on the number of words children hear before they enter school. Here's by age 3, so it's showing a 30 million word difference in the amount of words heard by children from welfare families by comparison with professional families. This is by age 3, let alone by kindergarten. When I was Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth, I'd visit kindergartens and routinely find children who were 2 or 3 years behind reading readiness, appropriate age level at kindergarten, and kids who were 2 or 3 years ahead. And if you examine the statistics on those quintiles, if you broke that into quintiles, you'd find very little movement between those quintiles over the course of the 13 years of public education. So in a certain sense, the battle is over before it's even begun because of opportunity statistics like this. Percentage of high school students who are enrolled in a college preparatory curriculum by low income, middle income, or high income level. So preparing people to be successful in college. One of our national goals right now is college readiness. Here's how we're doing. The International Baccalaureate is one high-powered preparation for college readiness, and here are the relative enrollments from high-income students in the blue and low-income students in the orange. Here are family enrichment expenditures. I'll talk about this more later on, but 20% of children's waking hours are spent in school. The other 80% are outside of school. Affluent families, families with privilege, are spending more than they've ever spent before on the education and enrichment of their children, pretty much 24/7 outside of school hours. Low-income families are finding it harder than ever before to make a living, let alone to spend that money on their children, let alone to spend the time on their children. And it turns out that this enrichment outside of school has every bit as much to do with achievement gaps as anything we do inside of school. And yet we have these huge disparities in opportunity. We know, for example, talk about making policy based on evidence. We know for a fact that there's summer learning loss for disadvantaged students who don't have access to high-quality summer learning opportunities, and that they fall backwards, and that students who have access to that kind of opportunity move forward. So in effect, what we have is a growing gap. We have a gap each summer of their experience, and that gap gets wider through the 13 summers that they're in school, and overwhelms many of the things that teachers and students try to do in the precious few hours that are dedicated to schooling. So, obviously all of this matters. As the governor so eloquently stated, it's a moral question. It's an ethical question. It always has been, but we've let it go. We've let it languish, in his words. But we better pay attention because the world is changing. The demographics of our nation are changing. So we've just moved to the point where the percent of low-income students in U.S. public schools is now a majority. A while ago, we moved to a majority of students in U.S. public schools are students of color. So we have here two groups with which we've historically not been very effective in public education. And they constitute the new majority. So it's pretty easy to make the case that we have this felicitous coincidence between our ethical obligation to do something about the challenges we're discussing today and our economic self-interest. If we're interested in preserving and growing our economy, if we're interested in preserving our democracy and our way of life, we got to get better at serving kids who we've historically not done so well by. That's the rationale for the Education Redesign Lab. That's the rationale for this very focused work that's part of the By All Means initiative that we are officially launching today. The basic premise is that schools alone are not strong enough. Schools alone are insufficient to do the job of all means all. When we set out to do education reform, we set out to educate all children to be ready for success. And we articulated and underlined and emphasized that all meant all. And we worked very hard. Nowhere have we worked harder than here in Massachusetts at achieving that goal. And yet after 2 decades plus of education reform, we still have this iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. And the question that brings us here today is, what are we going to do about it? How do we proceed? Why? Why do we have this persistent gap in the first place? Well, you may have your views, and we're interested and welcome the conversation on why this is. Here's our perspective. Was it the wrong goal? Well, for all the reasons that I've already talked about. for ethical reasons, for reasons of economic self-interest, it was absolutely the right goal. All means all is absolutely what we should be about doing. No question about that. So that's not the problem. Did we choose the wrong strategies over the past couple of decades? This is where we get into trouble in education circles, because while we generally speaking agree on our goals for young people, that we want them all to be able to participate in a 21st century economy, we want them all to be informed citizens and capable of being leaders, we want them all to be capable of becoming heads of families with all the values and character traits we associate with that. We want them all to be gratified individuals and lifelong learners. All of that we can agree on, but when it comes to how do we build a system to get there, well, that's where we have our violent disagreements. But nonetheless, we've had something of a national consensus over the past 20 years about how to proceed on this. We've installed standards, we've measured progress, we've held parties accountable, we've introduced a unprecedented level of choice into public education. We've focused on teaching in a deep and intentional way. We've used data more than we ever have before in managing and guiding public education. So all these strategies were necessary, but it turns out, as you've seen from the results, they weren't sufficient to achieving the goal that we had in mind. We didn't go deep enough. They didn't go wide enough. They didn't account for all the factors in children's lives that needed to be attended to. So then we raise the question, is it the system? Was it the delivery system itself? This factory model of education that we inherited from the early 20th century that was built in another time for another purpose. Even though what we do today in schools, if you look at just the arrangement of desks and students in a room, looks a lot like it did then. The world around these classrooms has changed dramatically, and virtually every other system in the lives of children, in the lives of adults, has changed. Communities, families, the economy, our role in the world, all these things have changed around schools. And yet we built a system in early 20th century America that was designed to socialize large numbers of immigrants quickly, to batch process, mass produce education so people could go into low skill, low knowledge jobs in factory that required only routine kinds of work. And yes, we improved and dressed up that system over the 20th century, but by the last quarter of the 20th century, we realized that the world had changed, economic competition had changed, competition among nations for educating their students had changed. We were no longer the preeminent nation, and what we were doing was insufficient. Well, we have an outdated, outmoded design in terms of our factory model of education, a model that, for example, assumes that one size will fit all. But you've just seen the statistics. Take the entry-level statistics. When you have a child who's heard 40 or 50 million fewer words than the child she's sitting next to entering kindergarten, you can't just give them the same process and assume that they're going to come out in the same place. You'd have to adjust and adapt to the realities of each child's lives. Again, not a deficit model, but a model that recognizes that children's experience has been different prior to coming to school. The notion that that all children are roughly the same when they come in, and we give them roughly the same process, and they'll come out in roughly the same place, belies the facts of children's lives. So one size fits all, the factory model isn't going to do it. Furthermore, we don't have enough time in our schools. As a society, we've now said to schools, who again account for about 20% of a child's waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12, we've said to schools, we want you to get to world-class standards in the important subjects that we're measuring, like English and math and science. We want you to give children a well-rounded education in history, in civics, in the arts, physical education, foreign languages, all these kinds of things. We want our children to have 21st century skills. We want them to be creative, to be collaborative, to think outside the box, and things of that nature. And lately we've been talking a lot about social and emotional skills, which are strong predictors of success later in life, things like grit and executive function and qualities of that nature, and schools should do something about that. At the same time, anytime we have a social problem in our society, if it's teen pregnancy, if it's violence, we ask the schools, why don't you take care of that? While you're at it, will you feed kids, offer medical services, and if you got the time, do driver education? It just doesn't fit into the old box. We're cramming all this stuff into the old box, and as a result, then we get in competitions between, is English and math more important than history and the arts? And that's not a conversation we should be having. But as adults, we haven't been willing to do anything about the system, the box. We accept that as a given in our education reform efforts. We spend all our time trying to optimize the box instead of thinking differently about whether a box is the appropriate model to have. Our current system totally underestimates the impact of poverty and the lives of children outside of school. We've already talked about that. So the conclusion is we need a new vision. We need a conversation. And Dean Ryan talked about that as one of the principal purposes of this initiative. We want to bring people together to collectively start to think about what that new vision looks like. If we were really to build a system that was about all means all, what would it actually look like? You can't simply mandate to people, as many of us naively did in the early 1990s, and say, get all students to proficiency, get all students ready for success, but basically do it with the same tools that we gave you to do it with earlier. We need to figure out if we built a system that would guarantee that poor children had all the opportunities to learn that children of privilege had, what would it look like? And how would we get from here to there? So that's what this initiative is about. And that's what we mean by student success. Not just talking about test scores, we're talking about all kinds of competencies that go into preparing people to be ready in these complicated dimensions. So we created an education redesign lab to do 4 big chunks of work. One is to just advocate for this kind of conversation that we're talking about here today. Another is to do deep work in the field, which is what By All Means is all about, and that's not our only effort. We have Audrey Soglin and Tom Lentz are with us today from Illinois. We've got a project there that links the teachers union in Illinois with the Pediatricians Association, and a variety of other projects that we're working on around the country. But By All Means is designed to go deep and focus on how you get this work done. To do research, to document what works and what doesn't work in building systems. You know, as we look at the areas of concern that we have, that I'll talk about in a moment, there are good programs all over the country on islands or in silos, in isolation. What we don't have is systems that make this work possible. So we're interested in what are the practical, what are the political, what are the financial, what are the cultural barriers that get in the way of being successful in system building. So it's why, in By All Means, we're going to document the work that gets done in the field. We're going to document the failures that are every bit as important as the successes. And we're going to figure out what are the new policy targets in education reform. Maybe we ought to be focused on Medicare policy, Medicaid policy, as we go forward. What school systems get reimbursed for doing for children, instead of having all of our education reform efforts and policy targets be within the traditional conception of our sector. And then finally, we're going to convene people like yourselves to build a field, to build a community of practitioners here who are committed to this broader sense of the work. So we have 3 primary areas. In other ways that I've talked about this work in the past, I've talked about we need a new engine to drive human capital development in the United States right now. We have had a Model T built in the early 20th century that was designed to go 30 to 40 miles an hour. We're now in the 21st century. We need a vehicle that can go 120 miles an hour. We've tried to rework that old engine and put a carburetor of standards on it, to wrap it with new choices, to create new features to strengthen that engine. And maybe we've gotten it up to 50 or 60 miles an hour, but it's not strong enough to do 120. So we've got to figure out how to do that. We got to build a new engine. And I'm here to say in all humility, we don't have the design. That is not what the Education Redesign Lab has. It's not as though we have a template that we're about to reveal to you that'll tell you all how to get the job done. But what we know is that's what we need, and that's what we need to work on together. And we know that the new engine ought to have at least 3 design principles. So I want to just quickly outline what they are. We need to personalize learning. We need to customize education to the needs of each and every child. Another way of putting it is we need a system of education that meets every child where he or she is in early childhood and gives them what they need inside and outside of school in order to be successful, starting in early childhood and going through some level of post-secondary education so that they can emerge ready for success with the characteristics of success that we cited earlier. That looks like an individualized, customized system, a little bit like an analogy I often use of a medical system. In the healthcare system, if we were doing what we are doing now in education, we'd open a hospital, and everybody who comes through the front door of that hospital, we'd say to them, irrespective of your ailment, we're going to give you the same treatment and the same length of stay, and hope that that contributes to the public health. We know it won't be perfect for everyone, but it's actually more convenient for us as adults to offer it this way, so that's what we're going to do. Well, it wouldn't work in medicine, not that medicine is the epitome of efficiency and effectiveness in our society. And it's not working in education either. The question is, what do we do about it? Education performs functions other than simply educating or schooling our youth. It's a massive child custodial system that's actually very popular with parents and employers all over the country. And we don't acknowledge that often enough. It's also a massive employment system. So there are all kinds of elements that keep us doing what we've been doing in spite of its irrelevance to the current realities. And we need to address that. So I recognize in what I'm saying about personalizing and customizing education that all of this is much easier said than done, which is why we need to do the field work that you're gathered here today to talk about. Secondly, integrating health and human services. We've got lots of examples of great programs who do this work around the country. We need to braid our institutions of health, social services, mental health, services that attend to the challenges and the impediments that come up in the lives of children outside of school with our education services and supports. We know educators and teachers are overloaded, so we're not saying to them, you've got to solve the problems in the lives of children outside of school. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the time, they don't have the authority, they don't have the language. But what we do want is when a teacher in a second grade classroom finds out that the little girl in the back of the room has gone homeless over the weekend and is sleeping in the back seat of her family's car, that teacher can pick up the phone and call somebody who does know what to do about it, who does have a sense of urgency, who can move that up the list of priorities, not only because the teacher feels ethically obligated to do that, but because that teacher knows there is no way, even with the best pedagogy in the world, the best curriculum in the world, that I'm going to reach this child until that toxic stress is eliminated from her life. So we got to figure out how to get that done. And as I say, there are a lot of good examples of programs, but the question is, how do we build systems? Finally, out-of-school learning. Again, the 80-20 relationship. We're asking schools with a 20% intervention to overcome an 80+% imbalance with vastly unequal opportunity outside of school. We know what it involves. Those of us who have privilege, those of us who, for example, schedule a myriad of activities in the summers of our children's lives to enrich them, know what this can mean. It's not schooling per se, it's enrichment. It's the opportunity to be stimulated, to be associated with different kinds of people, to do different kinds of activities, to get excited, to be outdoors. All the good things that we associate with summer camps and recreation and travel and good opportunities like this. But some kids get them and some kids don't. And we take this as a matter of fact. It's an accident of birth. And we can't afford that anymore if we're serious about all means all, because we know how much of a difference it makes in terms of children's capacity to learn and grow and compete with others. So all of this is the rationale for why we've convened this initiative called By All Means. And we're going to be talking more about that later with the teams themselves, but for those of you who are with us today and not part of the initiative, this is a 2.5-year project. It has the twin goals of triggering this national conversation, but then going deep in the 6 cities that are convened here today. Cities that have visionary mayors, mayors who have been willing to look beyond simply the provision of a quality public education system as to what they need to do in order to prepare all their children for success. They feel a deeper, broader sense of responsibility for that. And they're working with superintendents in their respective communities, and we handpick these communities for these qualities. Superintendents who are willing to work collaboratively with the community, with civic government, with anybody who could help in doing this work of All Means All. We picked different kinds of communities because we wanted laboratories. We wanted different kinds of places in which to see people go to work at this and to learn the lessons from those communities. And we started with medium and smaller cities because we're just getting our legs as an initiative as well. We will work closely with folks in the field, with the teams in the field. Each of these communities has convened a children's cabinet, and those children's cabinets are with us today and going to work on this. And then we'll bring them back here 5 times over the course of the initiative to tackle big topics like we're doing today, and then to move deeply into sharing the experiences of the work in the field. So that's it. That's the case. That's the way we're going to approach the work. That's why we're here doing it. It's why we feel this is the most important work of the 21st century, and I'm so proud, Dean Ryan, that the School of Education is willing to lead this work. It's not miracle work. We're not naive. We come from the political world. We know that we're not going to snap our fingers overnight, and education is going to be done completely differently in places all around the country. On the other hand, this matter of discomfort and pushing the envelope and thinking clearly and looking at the data on how successful we've been now in education generally and in education reform is really important work for us all to face up to. And I'm confident, and we've got so many examples of success, that we can move forward. We can do a better job of building systems and leaning into this sort of superordinate goal we have of all means all. We've made a start. There's a long way to go. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us today to join in this work. Thank you very much. We're going to take a 15-minute break in a minute, but I thought since we have a little bit of extra time, we would allow for questions or comments that anybody would like to make for about 10 minutes here, and then we'll adjourn for a break at 11:15. Anybody care to raise a question or a comment in response to anything that you've heard thus far today? Please, Mayor Schiff. Oh, yeah, we are doing this live streaming, so if you'd wait for the microphone, that'd be great.
All right.
Could you introduce yourself, please, Mayor?
My name is Libby Schaff. I'm the mayor of Oakland, California. I'm very pleased to be one of your field cities. My question is, you ran through those statistics slides very quickly, and I'm curious if you are finding a stronger correlation with low income versus race.
We've actually done better on race over the past 10 or 20 years. We've done some modest closing of the gaps. There's obviously a major coincidence between the race statistics and the income statistics. But I would say the more durable, the more persistent gap statistic has been along the lines of income rather than race. Yes, sir. I need a microphone up. We're almost there. I got a microphone for you.
You're starting to ferret out the nuanced reality between succeeding as a underfunded school and being expected to succeed, or being held accountable for failure if you don't. The narrative that we have by those who would like to continue in the kind of punishment mode is that look at those resilient children, look at those resilient schools that are succeeding despite being underfunded. Why don't you do the same? And I'm wondering if you're creating a counter narrative that's as easy to grasp for the public as that.
Well, it's a great question, and I'd say we're working on that. We invest an enormous amount of money in this nation in public education, and I don't make any apologies for the idea that we set goals and we measure progress and we try to hold folks accountable. But what I think we need to get right is how we take into account what the challenges are that face each school while not lowering expectations at the same time. And so what we're trying to say is that if we customize, if we look at the lives of children and the challenges children bring in, maybe we ought to flip some of the logic that exists in our society where, in general, for example, if you look at our school finance systems, we tend to have systems that advantage the advantaged. That's what you see on that New York Times chart that I showed earlier, and disadvantage the already disadvantaged. So that if we are going to have schools in which we have high concentrations of kids who come from challenged backgrounds, maybe we ought to focus on that group and those schools as the places that ought to get our greatest investments, and figure out how to give the educators there the tools to achieve the very ambitious goals that we have described for them. When I was Secretary of Education, we would identify underperforming schools in Massachusetts. I remember the first 40 that we identified. And of those 40 schools, virtually all of them had north of 85% low-income students in the schools. Now, if you step back from that, if you think it's strictly the school's problem, you'd have to think that somehow, mysteriously, all the incompetency in the system has aggregated around low-income youngsters. And if you didn't come to that conclusion, you'd say maybe there's something about poverty that suggests, on average, schooling is too weak in intervention to overcome it at scale. This is not to say sometimes schools get it right, sometimes teachers get it right. It can be done. But it's not either to sort of persist in a line of thinking that by talking about this subject, you're somehow making excuses, as opposed to acknowledging barriers and impediments. And I guess that's the narrative we're working on. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Derek Smith. Thank you for your presentation. I was really excited because you almost made it through without saying the C word that concerns me in ed reform, and that's compete. I wonder, and I hear it often, we often talk about being globally competitive, and I actually think that that's one of the major issues in ed reform, is that we use that C word instead of contribute. And I just wonder, in thinking about redesigning how we do education, if there's been any thought to how do you operationalize contribute and replace that with any conversations around competition.
Okay, good. I guess my response to that would be, I think contribute is critically important. I think it's something that, for example, in terms of civics education and how we connect our young people to their respective communities, that we don't have time to do in our traditional pattern of schooling, and it's something that we ought to emphasize and is part of that value scheme that looks at citizenship as a critical dimension. So I'm all in favor of that. I'm all on that. I don't think contribution and competition are necessarily mutually exclusive. In other words, I guess as I think, again, we're thinking here about we should want for all children what those of us who have privilege want for our own. So I think about my own children, and I do want my children, it's a competitive world out there, both within our communities and within our nation and internationally. You want your children to be able to thrive in that competition, to not be intimidated or not be overwhelmed by that competition. You don't want the competition to be the focus. The competition is sort of a characteristic of the environment, and you hope to give them the skills and tools so that they will make it in that competitive world, and yet still at the same time be contributing, caring people who have a sense of civic responsibility to their society. So that's what I'd hope. Okay, Elaine.
I don't have teacher voice, so I can't pull that off. So I'm Elaine Weiss. First of all, thank you so much for noting BBA's work. As you know, when you look at data on poverty and education and outcomes, one of the other trends we see, of course, because we have a really state and district-based system, is we have big trends of differences across states. In terms of poverty levels, in terms of funding of schools, and frankly, in terms of outcomes, where in our poorest states, we've got the best off kids performing about as well as the poorest kids here in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions, and I don't know whether you'll reach this, is what, if any, implications will there be from your work for states, for state policy, in terms of how they treat and support kids?
Well, it's a great question, and I was paying close attention to what the governor was talking about when he was talking about, the historic federal role in education, and we're now in a period where we're moving back from federal responsibility, pushing a lot onto the states and saying it's the state's responsibility there. And I think it's really important for some of us in national organizations and so forth to be keeping score of what the states are doing with this new freedom, so that we don't wind up having a race to the bottom here along lines that we've cared about, for these equity considerations. With respect to your particular question, I think because of the complexity of this work, we wanted to start in local communities and build models that we could then translate at a state level. So if I'm being really optimistic and idealistic about where we're headed down the road 5 or 10 years, I would hope we'd be having a room full of teams. We'd have 6 teams with 6 governors at the head of each of those teams, and a cabinet statewide, and a commitment to building out on some of the work that we're talking about here today. But we've got to stage it. Okay, let's take 1 or 2 more, and then we'll.
Hi, Paul. Gary Chapman with Communities and Schools.
Right.
Thank you so much for what you're saying. I think it's critical, the components that you've included in redesign, the personalized learning, the integrated supports, and the out-of-school time learning. At CIS, we see those huge opportunities, and we're seeing tremendous gains with kids that are getting those wraparound supports and higher graduation rates and improved promotions. So to really see that as part of this for the first time is just tremendous, so thank you.
Well, thank you for your work. Communities and Schools have done some amazing work in doing at a community level exactly the kind of work that we're talking about. And it's just one of many partners, many of whom are represented in the room, who we hope to connect with to help those in the city teams build out their work. Okay, we'll, go ahead, Mary. One more. We've got a school superintendent here with a question.
Mary Skipper, proud superintendent in Somerville Public Schools. It was very exciting to hear both our past governor and yourself reference the whole child. And I think many of us are here today from systems where the whole child is at the center, and that's what we're striving toward. And I'm curious that in talking about systems design, our current measurement of schooling and accountability is really a single measure, and that is of standardized testing. So when we look at schools and we count all of the things we've talked about today that we know schools need to do and play a role in, and along with their cities, in order to have students achieve, those same schools are still measured very singularly. And so I just wonder in the systems design if we will be talking at all about whole school quality.
I think what we measure becomes what's important. And I think that's one of the lessons we've learned about the reforms for the past 20 years, as you outline it. And I think a big part of this work and part of the research dimension, and I know a lot of my colleagues here at Harvard are working at and thinking deeply about constructing a parallel set of measures, not an either or, but a parallel set of measures that, for example, take into account factors like well-being, or take into account factors like engagement, take into account, some of the social and emotional dimensions we've been talking about, but we're not sure we're ready to measure. We're not sure those are ready for prime time accountability staging. So, I mean, there's some big questions in this area. We know there are a lot of things that we know are important to the development of our youngsters. Take social capital, for example, and access to various kinds of social capital. And how do we reward a system that spends its resources and energy in building out that social capital for kids and measure whether or not that makes a difference? I think of Jeffrey Canada, and I'll close with this. I think of Jeffrey Canada, the Harlem Children's Zone, talking about how in the HCZ he was trying to build an early childhood dental clinic. And he was trying to raise the money for that dental clinic, and he went around to all kinds of funders, and they kept saying, well, how's that going to show up in your student outcomes? When am I going to see the bump? How big a bump is it going to be? And he said in his inimitable way, he'd wake up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. thinking, what kind of causal link can I show between this dental clinic and the scores on math and English in second or third grade? And then finally, one morning, sort of exhausted by this exercise, looked in the mirror and said, well, I'm a parent. Would I ever be having this conversation with myself or my wife about whether or not we take our child for dental services? This is a non-conversation. We shouldn't be talking about this. But we should be tracking the well-being of our children. I mean, it's just this, any of us who are parents, and if we have privilege, if we have affluence, and we think of, are our children successful or ready for success? Well, yeah, we're thinking about their schoolwork and how they do. I mean, that's in there somewhere. But we're thinking about lots of other factors. Are they healthy? Are they happy? Are they engaged? Do they have friends? Do they relate well with other people? Do they love to get up in the morning and do whatever it is they're going to do? And all those kinds of things that you'd want to measure. Well, that's the kind of environment we should want for all others. And the question is, how do you build it? And how do you make it fair? And how do you institutionalize something that's very sort of particular to family and culture and things of that nature? And it's very ambiguous, difficult work. Thank you for signing up to work on it. Okay, we've had a lot of talking here. We've got a really interesting panel to come at 11 o'clock when we're going to bring our mayors before you. Please take a 15-minute break, and we'll see you back at 11. Thank you very much. Good stuff. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, if you could please take a seat, we're about to start. Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you please start taking your seats? We're about to start the next panel. Those might be off. How about now? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Good morning again. I'm still Jim Ryan. And I am delighted to be here with 6 mayors. I will say their names. We'll do this a little bit like school. I'll say their names and they can each raise their hands for attendance. Mayor Libby Schaaf from Oakland.
Present.
Mayor Jorge Elorza from Providence.
Here.
Mayor Joe Curtatone from Somerville.
Present.
Mayor Seti Warren from Newton.
Here.
Mayor Greg Fisher from Louisville.
Yes.
And Mayor Kim Driscoll from Salem. So welcome to all of you. It is a complete treat for me to be sitting with 6 mayors to talk about education. You are, as you know, a critical part of this work. You have the ability to convene entire teams across the municipality and the ability to devote resources in new and exciting ways. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I want to get started quickly. All your biographies are in the packet, so rather than introduce each of you, what I'd like to do is have each of you, in maybe 2 minutes or so, explain why education is important to you personally. I know it's important to all of your cities. I know it's a big part of your job, but I'd like to get a sense of why and how it matters to you personally. And we could just go down the row.
Great. Well, I'm a business person and entrepreneur that just happens to be mayor right now. And in my businesses, I've always felt that for us to be as successful as we wanted to be and for our people to be successful, their human potential had to be alive and flourish and thrive. And I feel like one of the jobs from the mayor should be to create platforms for human potential to flourish in a city. When I was inaugurated, I talked about 3 big values that would guide our city. The first was lifelong learning, which is obvious to this group. The second is health, physical health, mental health, and environmental health. But the third was to be an even more compassionate city. And critics or political advisors said, oh, don't talk about compassion, it makes you appear to be weak. And when you look at it through the lens of human potential flourishing, I said this is the most important job that a mayor and mayor's office should have. And I find it much more difficult for people to optimize that type of potential than for critics to sit home on the couch and be skeptical or root for Donald Trump or whatever they're going to be doing. So I think that's why the mayor's office should be involved with this, and it's something that comes from me from my family, and I'm trying to bring that to life as the mayor as well.
You said personal, so I'll just share a personal story. I mean, my first kind of major career was as a big corporate litigator at the biggest law firm in Oakland. But I was doing volunteer work at the West Oakland Boys and Girls Club. And I mean, I am like a lifetime just crazy, hair on fire, passionate about my city. Always have been. And like Mayor Fisher has said, like education is kind of the path to solving all of the things that plague the modern American city. But I was doing this volunteer work and I met this young man named Nathan, and he was 9 years old. His mother had died. He had had to repeat first grade, and he just didn't see himself as a good student at all. And I would come just one night a week and help him with his math homework. And to see a child suddenly start to see themselves as smart, start to get excited about learning, was just the most amazing personal experience that I had ever had. And it led me to quitting my job as a well-paid attorney and taking a job at half the salary to start a centralized volunteer program for the Oakland Public Schools. And thus began my journey in public service that really led me to being the mayor that I am today.
Again, for me, it's personal, thinking back on my time growing up in Somerville, short distance away here on Prospect Hill, to a working class Italian immigrant family. My first language is Italian. In fact, my sister taught me English. And thinking as we head into this conference about those experiences, the opportunities we had given to us by the public school system, and how the school system really served as a sanctuary for my parents who worked multiple jobs, a lot like the immigrant kids in the city that speaks 52 languages today. And in the challenges we face, but I thought also about the stories former Governor Patrick talked about the neighborhood shaping his life, and really the social fabric of my neighborhood and our community, and the mentors I had in the school shaping my life. And so, as an elected leader and someone who's coached in the school system, who has 4 boys, my wife would have 4 boys in the public school system, it's really personal for me, but it brings a certain perspective as a policymaker to understand how our policies impact the system that cultivate an environment to influence young people's lives. And I just think every day, as I go to sleep, am I going to provide them the same opportunities that I had?
I'm the mayor of Salem in my second term, and I'm really fortunate to be living in Salem, but I wasn't fortunate enough to be born in Salem. I'm a Navy brat, which means that we moved a lot when I was a youngster. My mother is from the West Indies. She was born in Grenada but grew up in Trinidad. So definitely a different culture in my household. Thankfully, well, maybe not thankfully, I didn't have a language challenge. I wish I spoke a second language. But I relate very much to the kids in my district who come from different backgrounds, who are newcomers. They do have a language challenge, many of them. And to think that we're not providing opportunities for children that could have been me, parents worked, latchkey kid, thankfully was involved and active and had caring parents and supportive families. But to live in a district that has challenges and to see them not being fully met for all kids is really real in my experience. Having 3 kids myself, 3 teenagers, having a fabulous experience going through our schools, but recognizing that not all of our families are sharing that same experience is real. And then being in a position as mayor, and I'm fortunate enough to also chair the school committee, and being able to do something about it is a responsibility. And for me, it's one that I take very serious. We see education as a community mission, and so pleased to be part of this effort, to be able to actually do something every day that matters in the lives of the families and the children who live in my community.
Good morning, everyone. Jorge Alorza from Providence. So I have a very personal connection to this as well. My parents are immigrants. They came from Guatemala. And my mother has a 4th grade education. My father has a 7th grade education. And they were never able to help me with my schoolwork during my time in school, but they always emphasized education. And so taking that was always very deeply embedded in me. I didn't always follow the path that they wanted, and I was a bit of a middling student throughout middle school and high school. And it turns out that when I graduated from high school, I just barely got by, and I was rejected from every university that I applied to. So state colleges and places where I really should have been transitioning to. I remember sitting at my high school graduation and just being very disappointed with myself while all of my friends were going away to school. I was stuck at home and trying to choose what my next step would be. And that's when I told myself that I was going to do my best, and I was going to do everything I could to show the world what my best could be. And I started applying myself to school. And I started off at community college, ended up transitioning to a 4-year school through a program for inner city kids, and ended up going to law school, and that completely changed my life. And so the two very impactful lessons that I draw from that is, first, that there are a lot of kids in our schools that have a great deal of potential, but for some reason or another have veered in the wrong direction. And I want to make sure that we build systems so that every single one of them can stay on course as a matter of course and not against all odds. And then the second lesson that really drives in me is, this idea that no one does it alone. I've been so fortunate throughout my life that people have believed in me and invested in me, such as the person who walked me through by the hand to fill out my FAFSA when I was at community college, and introduced me to a new program at the state university that I could transfer to. I understand that it's not just about providing high quality education inside the classroom. It's also about providing the support services and the mentorship services that many of our students need. And so now as mayor, I want to make sure that those same opportunities that I was able to take advantage of also exist for that next generation.
Thank you. Mayor Seti Warren, Newton, Massachusetts. As I was thinking, listening to my colleagues and thinking about Governor Patrick's speech this morning, and something kind of really captured me when he was speaking. He said, we have a huge challenge of income inequality right now, but the real question is economic mobility. And it got me thinking about how I landed in Newton. These things don't happen by magic. My parents both grew up in pretty tough neighborhoods in New York. My dad grew up in Harlem, and my mom grew up in the Bronx. And my dad's neighborhood was deemed the worst block in America at the time because of the drugs, gangs, and violence. Needless to say, the three things he used to talk about that got him away from a life of drugs and crime was the Police Athletic League in Harlem, New York, and the Catholic Youth Organization, CYO, and some of his teachers in school. He benefited from those supports, and he went to the military, went to Korean War, came back, met my mom, and they marched the Civil Rights Movement, and went to historically black college, North Carolina A&T together, and found graduate school at Brandeis here in this area, and eventually purchased the home where I live with my two children and my wife with GI Bill benefits. And my dad spent his life in education. He was Assistant Secretary of Education of Massachusetts and really developed programs for young people like himself for his entire life. And my entire family is in education. So when I think about this question, why is education important? It goes back to providing that economic mobility, that intergenerational mobility that my family had, that many of other families had sitting here. Every child in the city of Newton should have an opportunity to have what my family had, whether they come from households that are of lower income or middle income or high income. So that's why I know that it's made Newton successful education, and I know that it's why we'll make other cities successful, quality education opportunities.
Terrific. Thanks to all of you for those stories. I mean, one of the things about education that's so remarkable is everyone has a personal connection and personal story to it. So I view part of my job here is to stir things up a little bit. So we'll start that now. And I'll open this up to any of you, and you can feel free to comment on each other's responses. And I want to go back to Paul's presentation earlier this morning, where the argument was that we can't expect schools alone to overcome all the associated disadvantages of growing up in poverty. So we can't expect schools to, say, close the achievement gap between poor and wealthier families. So my question is, do you agree with that? Or do you think that's too pessimistic a view of schools?
Yeah, I agree with it wholeheartedly. We would pride ourselves in Somerville as our approach to understanding the community that we live in as a complex ecosystem. And this goes back to an interesting project we did more than a decade ago called Shape Up Somerville. It was the first worldwide community-based systems approach to reversing the trends of childhood obesity in a generation. But what it opened our eyes up was to the city's this complex ecosystem. And we as policymakers every day institute or develop policies that enhance systems around transportation, around public safety, public health, education, break them down or leave them void. They collide to create a consequence. In that case, it was childhood obesity. And more than a decade ago, while the nation's level of childhood obesity tripled in 40 years, Somerville's 46% of our school-age children were obese or risk of being obese. So we've taken a new approach in the last 10 plus years in our Nexus project in really mapping the systems of the community. And what we understand is, like in crime, you can't arrest your way out of crime, you cannot tutor your way to educational success. As policymakers, we have to see this complex system for what it is and what our role is in that. And understand how we cultivate an environment that gives a child the best opportunity to achieve and succeed. You know, the governor told an interesting story about kids being read to every day, having nurturing parents like my kids. They get 3 meals a day. And so I think they're better prepared when they go to take a standardized test in a school versus some child who maybe both parents, because some of them becoming so expensive, has to live somewhere else. Or maybe there's violence in the neighborhood. They don't get 3 meals a day. They're getting the convenience choice, not the healthy choice. And that collides to create some consequence and inhibit their ability to achieve. So I do agree with it, because the system's so much more complex. And if we think of it linearly, we're never going to overcome or meet our goals and objectives.
I would love to chime in. I mean, you asked that question to the perfect group of people. We are mayors.
Right.
And mayors fly at an altitude where we have both the privilege and, frankly, the burden of seeing the interconnectivity of everything. There are no silver bullets out there. And just like education can't do it alone, there's no single system that can do it alone. I was talking to my superintendent just before coming up here, and he was reminding me about the work that he contributed to my public safety plan, recognizing that safety cannot be delivered only by police. In Oakland, we're looking at how health, how housing stability, how economic stability, and frankly, how things like restorative justice and trauma-informed care contribute to safety. But also, he's noticing that his kids are coming to school more because their neighborhoods are safer for them to walk through to get to school. We're here with our major healthcare provider, Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser is recognizing that healthcare cannot be provided just by doctors and hospitals. That unless they're starting to address the social determinants of health, the environmental conditions and physical conditions that our kids live, work, and play in, the educational outcomes, the economic outcomes, we will not have enough health that the healthcare system will be able to actually deal with it. And so, I say that that's true of everything, that no one system can do it alone.
So I think the broader question then is, how do you get people involved? This notion of citizenship, and people aren't as engaged as they maybe used to be, if we're glorifying the past, or as much as they should be. So citizenship is taking care of yourself so you can take care of your family, taking care of your employer, so there's a good two-way system of value there. But third, doing something for your community in which you expect nothing in return, other than you get to live in your city and you get to be a citizen of the United States of America. And there's not enough people doing this. And this challenge is so big that we need everybody engaged. So let's take the business community, for instance. Some of the business community is jumping right in. So for instance, our Summer Works program, we'll have 2,500 kids this summer working in the community in different ways. But others aren't so engaged. So we can get them because they might morally know they have to engage. It's the right thing to do. B, we'd say, look, your future workforce is in the schools, and we will be a majority-minority community. You have to get engaged and make sure that you have the talent that you need tomorrow. So whether they get there morally or through the pocketbook or through fear, we'll point out that what happened in Ferguson, what happened in Baltimore, what you saw there was people feeling disconnected and hopeless. And oftentimes that comes through the school system. And Ferguson and Baltimore, what happened there, that's bad for business. So whether we can get them morally through the pocketbook or just out of fear, they need to come on board. So I think that's the bigger question for our communities when we take a look at the whole child and the system delivery of what that child needs. How do we get everybody involved? Because morally they know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. I agree as well. I visit schools every single week, and especially in Providence when we're visiting the elementary schools, you walk into the school, you feel the supportive and the positive environment. You walk into the classrooms, and you really do see the magic of learning happening every time. And almost every time it happens, I walk out of the school with my superintendent, and we scratch our heads, or I scratch my head, and I ask him, this is great. Why are the results, why are the scores so low? And that's led us to believe that it's not just what happens inside of the classroom, it's also what's happening outside of the classroom. And what we're doing in Providence right now is we're investing in data analysis so that we can better measure the growth that our students go through during the school year. Because, and we don't have the information readily available, but I have a hunch, and this hunch is that, speaking solely about our elementary schools, if we measure the growth of our students from the beginning of the year to the end of the school year, even though our schools are consistently rated the lowest performing, my sense is that our growth goes toe-to-toe with any school district throughout the state. And it's these other challenges, the out-of-school time, the summertime, that are responsible for some of the poor scores. And the approach that I believe we all need to take is we do have to break down these silos that naturally develop within our departments, but also throughout organizations in the community. And when you look at any dynamic system, you have different departments, you have department heads, and people who are held accountable for making sure that their shops are run well. But for any dynamic system, especially where we want to build an infrastructure of support, we have to have people that are responsible for the connections themselves. And that's something that's been lacking for a long time, at least in our city, and my sense is that in other cities as well. And so as we think about how to move forward, we have to have people who own the network and own those connections and are working every day to make sure that we nurture them so they're as strong as possible.
I'll build on that and just chime in with certainly agreement with all of my colleagues, but also a recognition of the challenge of coming up with a unified community vision around what does it mean when we say we care about kids, and then how do we leverage the assets within our community. So why should the PBD Essex Museum in Salem care about whether kids are performing, and how do we get them to help? Everyone says we want to help, but then what's the actual list we're having them work on? For some, it might be raising dollars to help with an out-of-school program. For some, it might be working an out-of-school program. For others, it might be career readiness. Synthesizing all of those assets, if you can get a unified community mission around education, is key, and then getting all those players to recognize that they each have a role to play within our community. We're only 8 square miles. We're 45,000. We're probably the smallest community here. All the challenges of a big urban district. If we can figure that out, that scale, that's going to be a remarkable experience, and that's a game changer. It's transformational in a community like Salem. But it takes a unified vision and leveraging and harnessing those assets. For folks who, I'm not going to be a teacher, I'm not going to read to schools, I'm a curator at a museum, what can I do? How can I bring that experience into what's happening, not just 8 to 3, but 3 to 8 as well.
I think your question was around the importance of things happening outside of school, am I correct, versus in school. It's critical that there is some architecture outside. I think that's where you're going. So just to sort of flip it, and it's great, Paul, that you have diverse cities here. As you all know, or many of you know, Newton is a very high-performing school district. We have incredible educators, some cutting-edge learning around social and emotional learning, interventions with students, teaching the whole child, the growth mindset. Got our superintendent here, our school committee chair here, our school committee vice chair, and assistant superintendents. They all do a terrific job, and we have a history of that. What we've acknowledged in the last several years is that there's a growing achievement gap in the city of Newton, and it's growing around kids of color and income levels. What we've found in the last several years is that the kids of wealthier families are coming into kindergarten in our classrooms, and because of the interventions that they had before they got into school, daycare, quality pre-K, the after-school interventions during elementary school and middle school, what we found is that the scores are higher with the wealthier kids who are white versus the kids who are not, and we've had this growing achievement gap. So what we started to do, we recognized that in the last several years, what we started to do inside the system was look at some interventions that we could provide to those students that were not achieving as high at the high school level. And we have some great programs going on, something called the Calculus Project, which is expanding due to the work of our schools folks, which really provides interventions for kids after school, places them in higher placement classes, math and science, and does intervention support after school for them. We started with a cohort of kids a number of years ago. We placed them in higher classes, and guess what happened in the 3 or 4 years after we placed them in higher classes with the supports? They scored just as well as the other kids wealthier families. So we know that by looking at data, and we did a demographics report in Newton, there are pockets, very small pockets of poverty compared to other communities, 6%, and then in some of our district schools, we have higher percent of free and reduced lunch, kids on free and reduced lunch. So what we want to concentrate on when we think about this economic mobility question, we think about what we're doing outside the classroom, is building that architecture that a lot of the wealthier families have and provide to their children before school, after school, in preparation for high school. So it's incredibly important. We're starting to see some evidence that some of the things that we are doing are working.
Great. So I want to build off that last question. So it seems like there's widespread agreement that you need to think beyond just the schools. And I've heard mention of a number of services, health, housing, after-school programs, tutoring, and the like. Which of these services do you think are most important? Do you have the resources to provide them? Is this a question of simply coordinating existing services? Or if you wanted to enact your own vision of what this would look like, would you need a lot more resources?
I'll start. For us, I think they're all important. And Somerville's not a rich city.
Yes, it is.
No, we're not. more than not as rich as city.
It's all relative.
More than 2/3 of our school children receive free or reduced lunch. Okay, we speak 52 languages. We welcome everyone in the city. We're a compassionate, accepting, tolerant community. But we have some major challenges, and you need all those count. And to do the necessary work we need to do, you need the engagement of every stakeholder and ally in the community. The Shape Up Somerville project was a collaboration between the city, the schools, and the community. It was a classic adaptive challenge. The disequilibrium that 46% of our school-age children were obese or being a risk of being obese, that we were nurturing the unhealthiest generation in our lifetime, and the consequences of their overall health, nurturing education, mobilize people to get on the edge of their chair and say, I want to own this. And the work takes, a lot of this is adaptive work that we need to identify as many stakeholders and allies, whether it's in the business community, whether it's teachers, whether people live in the city, who care about these issues and get them to own the work and do the work. They all need to be part of it. And for us, I mean, if you look at our team here as part of this project, it speaks to the relevant, incredible amount of care and compassion and focus on the attention of trying to build a healthy, happy, and productive community, and what education means to that, and tackling education as it reconciles against the poverty challenge. We all have to own it. We all have to do the work. And if we didn't have the assistance and the great engagement of the social service communities, the anti-poverty agencies, the schools, and every stakeholder in our life, we would not see the success we're seeing in our student growth today. Somerville is in the top 12 percentile student growth percentile in the Commonwealth. That's unheard of. And it has to do with understanding the system and engaging everybody as part of this work. And all those issues you mentioned are critical to doing it.
Mayor Driscoll, do you feel like you have enough resources to do all you want?
Yeah, I definitely don't, but I would also say to you that I don't know that we ever will. So the option of, oh, we've got all the money we possibly could need, all the resources that we could pull together, isn't real.
Right.
And let's just, paint all the windows black and leave if we're only going to work in a world where we have all the resources. I think the challenge is not letting that become a defeatist attitude or approach to doing this incredibly important work. You don't boil the ocean, you start with a puddle, and we've got to recognize what our value system is, what's important, and then you prioritize. And it can't happen just within a school district. Of course, it's a community mission. And, we've all got well-rounded teams here. There's the health component. I know for us, one of our biggest challenges are social and emotional, dealing with the trauma that so many kids at younger ages are coming into our school district and not feeling prepared for that. Dealing with multiple languages, and how do we make sure we're not pigeonholing students who don't speak English as their first language. If we were in an affluent community and kids spoke 2 languages, we'd be celebrating that. Somehow in an urban environment, it's looked at as a challenge, an obstacle, a barrier. That's crazy, especially when the demographics of the community in which we live in and the world in which we live in are shifting so dramatically.
So you mentioned of priorities. I'm curious, a question to the other mayors, how would you prioritize, given that we live in a world of scarcity and you don't have an endless supply of resources? If you're thinking about out-of-school services, out-of-school resources, what comes to the top of your list?
But I believe if we make the appropriate investments up front in human assets, we will save so much money on the back end with kind of disaster mitigation. That, we know that investing in early childhood education reduces the chances that we're going to be having to pay. I mean, the 80,000, 800,000, plus versus the $200,000 minus. That's compelling. So again, as long as we keep on letting ourselves be stymied by this idea of constrained resources, we miss the opportunity to say, maybe we need to just, God, I'm sounding like a Republican or something, that we need to just start all over. I'm not.
You're sitting on the right.
Sorry. But my point is, the image of the classroom that looks exactly the same from 100 years ago. The inefficiency, we talk a lot about public-private partnerships, but in Oakland, we're really having some honest conversations about public-public-private partnerships. How all the multiple layers of government create inefficiencies and redundancies. We're really trying to bulk up our collective impact strategy. There are so many well-meaning, great programs and initiatives in our city, and yet somehow they are not aligning and having the collective impact of moving the needle for the whole city.
And then how can you ask that question in your city without all the various stakeholders going crazy that they think their program is being attacked?
Well, and you talked before about we have a large employment program with the current system. And so the adults versus the children.
So in our school system, we have a big school system. Our superintendent, Don Hargens, is here. We have about 100,000 kids in Jefferson County Public Schools, and they're starting to ask some of these basic questions. The classroom should be the center of the universe. What should be the extra services that go in there? And then some of the stakeholders are involved around that all of a sudden think that, I'm going to be attacked if you're asking that question. So how can you start your community with this big question of how do we support all of our kids before we even get into the priorities and agree that is, in fact, what's going to take place? We frequently hear in education, it's all about the kids. As kind of the guy that's new to the conversation, a lot of the discussions I hear, they don't appear to be all about the kids to me. They appear to be about everything but the kids. So how do we reorient that so that, in fact, that vision comes true? That's a real hard cultural change and a behavioral change for a lot of people in our cities.
So, another really important component to this are the parents. And in Providence, we have a program called the Providence Talks. And Providence Talks is an early intervention from 0 to 30 months that works directly with parents to address this 30 million word gap. And what we're learning through this project, a number of really different, really interesting insights. But perhaps most importantly, we all know that a child's most important and lifelong influence is their parent. Right? That's their first and most important teacher. And through this Providence Talks program, we're not only improving the interaction between parents and the child, but we're also empowering the parents to take a very active role in their children's education. And as these children, they transition into kindergarten and first grade, just having the parents feel empowered that they can actually do something to influence the outcome of their child's education is tremendously powerful. And so, as we build up this infrastructure of support services and learning tools, making sure that parents feel as though they're accessible to them, and that they play a role in whether or not their children moves forward, is tremendously important. But in terms of prioritizing one intervention versus another, my guess is that all of our communities are different. We have slightly different priorities. or at least they shift in different shades. But I would say that for all of us, we have to take stock of the resources that we have at hand. In Providence, we're very fortunate to have a very, very robust network of after-school programs. And so how do we better integrate them and build upon the relationships that those young people, sometimes college people, college students have built up with our students, and how do we leverage them throughout the summer, where we can't possibly pay for summer schooling and instruction throughout the summer, but perhaps we can build off of those relationships that have already been established and in a very low-cost way, make sure that some of these young folks are checking in with our students and saying, how's it going? Are you staying on course? Are you following these online learning tools? I agree with Libby 100% that, and with Kim, that this can't be a deficit model. Sure, we can't possibly muster up the resources to do everything that we need to do, but that absolutely doesn't mean that we can't do it. We just have to be creative and thrifty about it.
Yeah, just jump in. Just two quick things I wanted to add. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble before I get home tonight if I don't mention my wife, who works here at Harvard at the Center on the Developing Child, Jack Shankov. She's worked there for 8 years, and if I don't talk about what you just talked about, which is early childhood and the parent and working with the family is incredibly important. Paul had mentioned 80% of a child's life is spent outside of the classroom, which dovetails into two other points I want to make. One is we have to realize, I believe, that this is the next frontier when we think about education. We're on new ground. When we start talking about interventions, building architecture outside of the classroom, this is innovative discussion, and we need to embrace it. We need to look at the data behind it, because there's a lot of it, even beyond what Paul had mentioned about the income disparities. We need to not be afraid of innovation and trying new things based on that data. A lot of organizations that we all work with are used to doing things a certain way, and they do it over and over and over again, and that's difficult. And we need to not be afraid to collaborate and not continue to do things in silos. And the last thing I would say, one of the elephants in the room here, I don't frankly agree that we need to talk austerity here when we're talking about investment in these priorities that matter. I think as a community beyond our cities, we need to talk collectively about giving a little bit more as far as revenue and asking people to pay a little bit more in taxes to invest in things that matter. It doesn't mean we're throwing money at the problem. We will measure it, we will be research-based and evidence-based, but the facts are you can't move the needle in the dramatic ways that I know these folks want to and all of us want to by just being innovative and collaborative and measuring. We're going to have to, as a community, and this goes nationally, statewide, and all the rest, we're going to have to invest resources. Newton has the opportunity. We've passed 3 tax overrides here in Massachusetts. 3, I think. Where's Dory? 4. Matt, is it 4 we've passed in Newton or 3? 3 tax overrides in the history of Proposition 2.5. That's not that many, but it's more than a lot of other communities can. In Massachusetts, you have to, if you levy beyond 2.5% locally property taxes, you have to put it on the ballot. We have a tax base that's diverse enough that I could go out and ask for that. A lot of communities don't have that tax base where I could ask, and I asked for one in 2013 to invest in education and public safety and all the rest. And we're able to fund some of these programs that I mentioned to provide interventions for kids. But I do think we need to have that revenue conversation and not be afraid to talk about it.
Right. So in addition to revenues, I imagine that there are some political obstacles to achieving the sort of vision that each of you has described. I mean, Mayor Fisher talked about getting the business community involved, and his observations that although we often talk about the fact that education is all about the kids, sometimes it doesn't seem to be all about the kids. So I wonder if you talk about the political obstacles to providing the sort of services in or outside of school that all kids need, and how you go about overcoming those obstacles. Whether it's active opposition from constituencies who feel that they might be being attacked, or whether it's apathy or a sense that this is not my problem. how do you actually deal with the politics?
I'll give an example. Mary Gwen Wheeler's here. We created something in our community called 55,000 Degrees about 5 or 6 years ago. And so as a community, we merged our city and county government about 14 years ago. So we're a big city population-wise, about 770,000. So we're one of the bigger cities in the country, but we have 400 square miles, not 8. So it's a big city.
Slightly bigger.
That way, that's
Slightly.
right. So when we did that, we knew we needed to increase our educational attainment. So 55,000 degrees is 55,000 more college degrees in the community than we normally would have by the year 2020. And when we achieve that, we'll have 50% of our adults with either a 4-year or 2-year degree. And right now we're around 41%. The national average is 39%. So pulling that together required a broad collective impact throughout the community of bringing together all the various stakeholders, from nonprofit to for-profit to education, and getting everybody to agree it was a problem. But it took a year or so to get, probably 2 years to get unanimity around that, and then we've been into the program now about 5.5 years. So there's no instant pudding when you're doing this type of work. And as we've gone into the work, some of the people that were committed to it early on dropped off. As we've gone into the work, what we found, what's our biggest barrier to success right now is we've leveled off. Well, surprise, shockingly, Paul, it's poverty, okay? And hence, one of the reasons why we're so excited to be here with our colleagues that are interested in this as well. So most people are happy if you're working on this as long as you're working within the existing dollars that you have. But we live in this anti-tax environment that is really discouraging sometimes. Not to say, Seti, like you said, we want to use money wisely, but I can tell you as a mayor, it's really sad and discouraging. We see these young kids getting ready for kindergarten, pre-K, and they're so full of life and excitement and enthusiasm. And you see one kid at the age of 6, 3 years behind the other kid, and knowing that probably they're never going to catch up, maybe 10% of them do. And then you watch them get to 3rd grade, and you see the 3rd grade reading level differences, but they're still buoyant and energetic as a young child. And then you see them go through middle school, and you see that light start to dim in them. And then you see them in high school, they're just kind of hanging out. And then you see them become a victim of a crime or participate in crime. And you're saying, you know, our system clearly is not working. You know, we're happy to pay $25,000 to incarcerate these kids, but we won't spend $4 or $5 grand for universal pre-K. You know, so you gotta raise some hell, and you gotta be louder about it until we wake up as a society to say our system is wrong. And I think we're making a little progress, but it's way too slow.
You know, in Oakland, the politics are not the problem. We have incredible political support to fund education. Now, California has something called Prop 13 that limits property tax revenues. But I'm actually tease my superintendent. He feels like every 2 years he brings a new revenue measure on the ballot that the rest of us have to compete with. And I'll tell you, Oakland voters pass it. They pass revenue measures for our school district almost every 2 years. The only one that failed was a parcel tax that would have given teachers a raise. And you would be surprised to know that the teachers union campaigned against it. And it's because it also would have given a raise to charter school teachers. And because of that, they campaigned against it. And in Oakland, 25% of our students, public school students, attend charter schools. So that would be the one political quagmire we have. But yet with all this generosity, you know, getting back to the family issue, and I'm glad that Paul brought up the idea that schools have just got to recognize that maybe the family and community structure is not as strong as it once was. 45% of our public school students do not live in a 2-parent household. They either live in a single-family household, a kinship situation, or foster care. 45%. It's the predominant culture.
Yeah, I agree. For me, it's not so much politics, because if you give me a little political context about every progressive activist that was exiled out of Cambridge lives in my city, seeking a better life and escaping the tyranny. And this is so much more about leadership. The interesting example about budgets, you know, you have 5 people here, and I mean 6 people think differently about this, but you know, so many of our colleagues will default to say, look, you know, why is this approach important to me? I give my money to schools, you know, the budget's balanced, I have a great bond rating. I'm sure if I told you that about Somerville, our highest bond rating ever in our budget balance, you want to come to my city. But, can you raise your family there? Does your child have a true choice to succeed? Can you actually live there for the long term? Tells nothing about whether life is worth living in your city. And this is really about leadership. And my role, and it's just about writing a check to the schools, and the superintendent has it made, because we've increased the budget 30% over the last 5 years for a city that does not have a lot of resources, because it's a priority. But how do you take on these ideological challenges? How do you get people to own and do the work? And leadership is a very lonely enterprise. It is about, as has been alluded here, raising the constructive disequilibrium, turning up the heat of the issue to get me off the back of my chair on the edge and saying, how do I own that? How does the fact that we're raising an unhealthiest generation of kids move you to do work, or that more than 100 of my high school students are functionally homeless because they're doubled up in closets and living rooms or other homes to stay in my city because their families actually want to be part of the education system. How do we do that? It's about pushing that fact in right to you, to pluck your heartstrings and your values, to understand these are your children's friends, they're our neighbors, they're our colleagues who want to be part of this great city, and we need to mobilize to own the work to do it. It's not as simple as just making an investment or making some policy decision, but we have to understand, I think you find people here who understand our role as leaders in facilitating that public discourse and dialogue to do the necessary work to get to where we have to go. And it doesn't happen quickly. Sometimes it takes time. The issues may be maturing in nature. And again, in being in our role, it can be like being on a desolated island on your own. We have to absorb and survive leadership and understand the adaptiveness, the adaptive nature of this particular challenge.
I was just going to say, I think the biggest challenge is answering why and getting a community to understand why and being able to communicate that. I don't know that we'll ever get the politics right. There are hard feelings in charter versus non-charter. We've had hard discussions within my own city. I'm glad my teachers union president is here, because I think we have to have those hard conversations if we want to really be able to advance progress. But rallying people around why. Why are we making a hard decision? What's supporting it? What is the data that's leading us to prioritize something that is hard? And the last component would be in a city that's a little bit smaller, my size, your teaching force are your neighbors, are your friends. It's not this group of folks who come into your city and work here and leave. And that makes the conversation harder to talk about performance or where we need to go. And everybody's working hard, but are we working smart? And we have to change it because we're working hard, but we're not getting the results we need. Those are really super hard conversations to have, especially when you know each other and we see each other on the sidelines at soccer games or in the grocery store. And that happens at the local level. So the accountability is a little bit higher. Answering why, being able to have a community that understand why, I think might make the politics easy. I think those are always going to be challenges.
So can I just do a quick follow-up? How do you answer the question why? I mean, what has been the most persuasive answer you've provided to that?
So the governor who spoke earlier had this great line that you never get a second chance to be in third grade, and I think thinking about our superintendents here and often says, our largest union is our students, but putting those kids first and trying to relate to what their needs are. And that doesn't mean we're putting educators second or taxpayers second or, the other partners that really make our school work, but really understanding the impact decisions are having on students. So we're one of the only school districts I know of that stopped our turnaround model, restarted it, and did a Horace Mann charter that we voted on as a school committee. Hard rallies, not happy educators, parents who didn't necessarily, some loved it, some didn't, but we didn't think it was working and we had to push stop and we needed a restart. And it wasn't for lack of effort by the people in that building at all, not one iota, but it needed a fresh start. And it's still hard, even with a fresh start. So I think we were able to move in that direction because we talked to people about what the challenge was. We're spending more money, we're not necessarily getting the results, this is why we want to do this. Still hard, still politically something that has challenges. But I think people respect us not sweeping it under the rug and acting like, it'll be okay. It's somebody else's problem.
very specific example that we've gone through in my city is, when I came in, we did an assessment or an administrative audit of the school department, meaning the administrative offices. And what we found was that our administrative offices, they hadn't evolved over time, frankly, to meet the changing needs of the school district. And so, we commissioned a report, the consultants came in, and they laid it all out before us. And I saw this as a call to action. I said, oh, wow, it's plain as day right here in front of us. And then, I went to some education experts that I rely on, and, they sort of shake their head and they say, Mayor, we've known this for 6-7 years. There was a report 6-7 years ago that said the exact same thing and nothing happened. And so, I took that and I said, well, I can guarantee you that 6-7 years from now, folks won't be saying the same thing. We're going to take action. And we started this process. We engaged the different stakeholders, and through the good work of the superintendent and everyone involved, we were able to begin the first step of changing not only the structure, but transforming the culture in central administration. And it's difficult because anytime that you're talking about change, people see that as loss. And part of the outreach and part of the conversation has been that change isn't necessarily going to result in loss to you. Change might actually make your life, your job, that much easier. And so, that was a series of conversations that were difficult. And what I learned through that process is that, you really have to over-communicate in these circumstances, because when you're dealing with uncertainty and there's a lack of information, people will fill in that uncertainty with some of their worst fears and concerns. And being able to speak directly to the people who were affected and whose work lives were going to change from it, and reassuring them that not only would this help them, but it was also absolutely needed for our school department, help to make the transition in the process sooner. And the reason why I give that example is because that's absolutely tied to this political will, political leadership, and political leadership issue. Because all of these changes, they're all difficult, but they could be made that much more difficult or that much easier by the way that you go about it. And as a default, something that we do in Providence is think collaboratively, think about partnerships, and engage people early on in the process. Because even some of these very seemingly intractable and difficult decisions or challenges that you face, there's a way through, and that way through really has to be with partnership and engaging stakeholders.
Beyond the resource question, all of us have this platform. We're the chief executive officers of our city. And it's a pretty powerful platform. It's a convening platform. It's a visionary platform. I was thinking back to Greg Fisher's 55,000 degrees. And what he did in Louisville and bringing all the stakeholders together, setting long-term goals. About 4 years ago, as Newton Public Schools were in the throes of trying to close the achievement gap with kids who needed some interventions, I looked at what we could do outside of public schools in the summertime. And so I had a vision of creating a high school internship program for first-generation college students based on some work I had done in a previous job I had in running a high school internship program. And it was a tough ask initially. We had, the first summer we had 6 kids, I think 6 or 8 companies that agreed. I personally made the ask. We didn't have any stipend or anything that went along with it. But what I said was that first year as I got people signed on, yes, I showed them the data, and we looked at how high school internship programs actually help not only graduation rates, but also success in the job market. But I also talked about the experiences of a lot of kids that are in Newton Public Schools, and it really touched the company's experiences and what they had gone through and their families had gone through. If they just had that one supporter opportunity, they could actually, they actually did a lot better. And we'd have these conversations. Needless to say, we're in our 3rd year this year. We're going to have 36 kids in our program, and we have over 25 or 26 companies, and we have stipends from our local banks. that we're providing to kids that wouldn't normally have a shot at an internship program. But we brought those stakeholders together, I did, using my platform, and made the case that this would create real opportunity in their home city. And I think that's a powerful platform we all have, and I know all my colleagues have done things like this in our own cities.
So, I've heard mention of charter schools a few times and teachers' unions a few times, and both are controversial topics in education, as you well know. So I'm curious what you see the role of charter schools and the role of teacher unions playing in your own vision of education improvements in your cities.
So I'll say, for my city, we need all hands on deck. I don't think that, and I don't think of teachers' unions as controversial. I think of them as incredible assets within our district that have a strong position that might be different than mine. We have a charter school in our community. It would be great if the funding process didn't work the way it did in Massachusetts, that it takes dollars away from the public school district, but the charter school is not doing anything illegal. They're following the law, and they are very high performing. And they have, I think, helped highlight where we need to get and where we would like to compete and how we could collaborate together, and we're trying to do more of that. But, you know, we used to house a coal plant in Salem. You know, coal's the worst thing in the world, even when you house a coal plant. But the energy crisis, we had folks always telling us, you know, you can't shut that coal plant down, we need the power. And we had every environmentalist saying, you have to shut that coal plant down. Really good disparity on this issue. The bottom line is they were both right. And I think when it comes to education, my analogy to energy is we need all forms of energy. We need all forms of education helping support kids. And I wish it wasn't so hostile and wasn't so divisive. And frankly, it isn't in my community. But to think that we can let that divide a city where they're all constituents, they're all my kids, we can't let that happen. We've got to learn from each other and hopefully be in a position to utilize the different skill sets that come together for the best interest of kids.
So I came somewhat late to the education reform debate, and I would hear from afar, you know, the different sides in, you know, charter school versus traditional public schools, and you know, I thought they both had merit. When I was running for office, you know, it came to a head, and I had to make a decision. And what it all came down to, I know it was tremendously contentious, but I kept hearing from parent after parent after parent, and they were demanding more choice and better school options. And so that's what convinced me that there's absolutely a role for charter schools in the equation. And there was a recent survey done in Rhode Island, something along the lines of 66% of parents approve of charter schools. Another roughly 20% didn't have an opinion, and only a small percentage were against. And so, you know, sometimes, you know, we listen to what's on the media, we listen to some of the, you know, angriest and loudest voices, but beneath the surface, there's strong support for choice. And in particular in Providence, what we want to do is emphasize the positive role that charter schools play in our community, and we're doing much more to integrate the best practices that charter schools, through their flexibility, are uncovering and importing that into our public schools. So that's yet another situation where potentially very, you know, antagonistic and difficult conversation that can be turned into a positive for the district. And you know, as far as charter school, the charter school funding, that is tough for our city, as it is for many cities throughout the country. But if we emphasize that there's a role for them and there's a value that they're adding to the public school system, I mean, let's not forget that they're educating, you know, the same students, the same children. I think that there's a compelling case to be made that, you know, the sort of top level advocacy and the, you know, antagonism in the debate, you know, that's taking place at one level, but it's you know, touching. Charter schools are touching people's lives and touching their interests in a very different way, and in a way where, you know, our parents are asking for them. You know, the example that I always share with charter schools, when I was running for office, this is about 2.5 years ago, there was a woman in the community, a very strong advocate, very vocal. She was telling me how much she disapproved of charter schools in Providence. And I said, okay, I just took it. Then I became mayor. And that same woman was in my office pleading with me to see what I could do to get her child into a charter school. And so, that really brings it full circle that, the debate is one thing, but when the rubber meets the road and we're talking about real children's lives and their parents' choices, people want choice.
Yeah, I'll echo what Driscoll said. And, it is all hands on deck, and I actually believe you should give as many innovative education choices to families as possible. I mean, we can debate, and there's a strong debate, and I agree with Mayor Driscoll on the execution of the charter school movement in Massachusetts, and some negative consequences as a result. But they're an important player in providing, again, innovative choices. And we had this whole, we heard the whole narrative really, and one size doesn't fit all. And I think having those innovative choices in our communities is critical. And we can spend the whole conference on debating how we did it in Massachusetts and other states and the inequities that it may have caused in some communities. There's a strong fear now in Massachusetts of potential uncapping and sort of unfiltering or unfettered proliferation of more charter schools in our communities. And at times, I think the debate is, I think there's been some leadership failure in upper levels of government really taking on the challenges communities face, or having this conversation on public education and the system as a whole around poverty and all the challenges cities face, communities face to educate children. And the default has been to just create charter schools. And the same, I think that failure has been with different institutionalized special interests like teachers unions. However, they're all critical stakeholders and allies in the important conversation we have to have, and it cannot be ignored.
Yeah, it's in service of what? So the polarization has become a distraction from what we all need to fight for, which is quality schools. Quality schools that educate kids and all types of kids, as well as have fair working conditions for the teachers and the adults that deliver that education. In Oakland, our superintendent has started something called the Equity Pledge for our charter schools. And that's a vehicle to create some clear expectations about how our charters can be in service of equity and also contribute to the larger conversation of lifting up the whole district. And in exchange, we're trying to provide all families kind of equal information about what all their choices are. And so we are really trying to move past that polarization and get to the all hands on deck solution.
So I've had the great opportunity to ask you questions. Now I want to allow the audience in the last 15 minutes. If you have questions for the mayors, the floor is open. And does someone have a microphone? Sure.
The Providence Talks programs have really intriguing impact on the 30 million word gap. Could you or one of your folks tell us a little more detail how it works and whether it's working?
Sure. So the Providence Talks program addresses the 30 million word gap. And essentially what it is we know that there's this research, really compelling research, that tells us that many of our kids, they're already behind when they enter kindergarten. And they're behind because they hear fewer words. And what the Providence Talks program does is we have these little electronic devices that measure the level of conversation that children have with parents, even beginning at 0 months. And we don't measure words, and we also don't record words. But what it does is it measures the turns of phrases. So I talk to you, you talk to me, I talk to you. Those are 3 turns of conversation. And what we found is really interesting. The first is that the parents who in the entry surveys believed they needed the program the least are the ones who, of course, need it the most. And through the different approaches that we have to delivering the Providence Talk service, we've found that it has positively changed the interaction in about 30% of the times. And from what I understand from social science research, an intervention with that changes outcomes 30% of the time is fairly high. So we're excited about that, but we're also working right now to bring the program to scale. It's been very successful at this point, getting beyond the pilot phase, but what we're very interested in is how do we bring this to the 20,000 kids throughout the city. So that's a challenge that we're facing right now, but we have great leadership. I'm certainly behind it, and we're mustering all the different resources so that the Providence Talks program is connected with a host of different social services around it as well.
Mayor, that was a Bloomberg Award winner, correct? That's
Correct.
how it got the initial funding.
That's right.
Perfect example.
I'm John Farnham with the Mortgage Family Foundation. We believe investing in leadership, and clearly you all are amazing leaders. Talk about your plans to transition this priority beyond your terms and how you're preparing for that and what your plans look like.
I'd be happy to start on that one. One of the most ambitious things that we've launched, and I've just been the mayor for a little over 1 year, is something called the Oakland Promise. And it's a cradle to career initiative that we believe in 10 years will triple the number of Oakland public school students who graduate from college. I like to say I don't just want to get them into college, I want to get them out of college. And it's starting with giving babies who are born into poverty $500 college savings accounts. So we're not going to know if that works for another 25 years. And in Oakland, we have term limits, so I will be long out of the mayor's seat by then. And so we really have worked hard on building support that is wide and deep. We invited just every member of the community to sign on as a champion of the Oakland Promise. You don't have to be an organization, you can just be John White. His name tag is right there, and sign up. And then we also have, and just, by the time we even launched this initiative, we had formally signed on 150 different community organizations to be official community partners of this initiative. Because again, we recognize that it would not be successful if it was seen as an initiative of this mayor and this superintendent. It really needed to have the ownership of the whole community. And so just systematically engaging and having a formal way of making people pledge and then having regular communications to that kind of, we almost run it like a campaign because we need people to carry this. It's also requiring a lot of private resources. Already we've secured $23 million towards the first 4 years of operation. That is not a small lift. And so that's another reason why you've got to run it like a campaign.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. How does it sustain in any great effort in the community? It has to be beyond any individual bureaucrat or elected official. It has to be based, the expectations based on a certain set of community values. And what we're doing right now in Somerville is we've actually launched our first ever community cabinet. Is really a collaboration, a formal collaboration with the cities and schools where you have different education heads of maybe the history department or in the guidance department with the police chief and public health agents and thinking about the system, the ecosystem, the city as a whole and having that conversation. And part of the narratives that are starting to filter out is thinking a long-term comprehensive education plan, a community value-based plan in line or much akin to what we did in a plan called Summer Vision. Somerville had developed its first comprehensive plan outlining not what we're going to build, but who we're going to be by 2030. And that plan really embodies the community's values. If you go to the website and you look at Summer Vision, you go to the city's website, there's this wordle, and it has basically the DNA of the community, where you can see the community double down on its diversity, its originality, its creativity, its people, the human, sort of the social equity of the community. And one of the thoughts, and the superintendent and I are having this conversation earlier about having this approach on the education plan in the future, not the substantive academic programs we're focused on, but the values of the city as reconciled with the educational goals of every child and giving every child that opportunity to achieve and succeed and embodying that with the values of the community. I think that's how you make it sustained, because it's not about one person. Even the Shape Up Somerville initiative I mentioned here, it wasn't the mayor, it was a community rallying around an important adaptive challenge and owning it and doing the work. And the Summer Vision Plan, it was 3+ years of community-based work, and the community leads every conversation about future development, future growth, sustainability, challenges around housing and displacement and gentrification with the value statements of making Somerville an exceptional place to live, work, play, raise a family. That is the orienting value of the community, and having that conversation around schools is something will sustain this work long-term, well beyond any of us who are around the office.
Mayor Warren?
There's a phenomenal report out of the Boston Federal Reserve entitled Resurgent Cities. It was authored by a number of people, including a man named Rod Walker, who I got to know. What it did is it took 25 cities over a 25-year period and looked at their demographics and made sure they were similar. And they measured, including the economy, and they measured key indicators over the 25-year period. Education, attainment, employment, health, and there were 10 cities that actually had higher levels of success than the remainder after looking at a 25-year period. One of them was Providence. But the key ingredients out of this report, and they went to visit the cities in addition to doing some background research, was that there was a civic architecture that was built over a period of time. And that civic architecture built long, medium-term, and short-term goals over a 25-year period. In some of the cities, there were private sector entities that led the effort. Some of the cities, there were colleges that led the effort with the political system, the mayor, city council, educators, and all the rest. So I really studied that report, and I embraced it. And what we've done in Newton, based on that report, and I've also visited some of the cities as well, but I've based sort of our model on that, which is a politician, as my friend Mayor Curratone said, and also Mayor of Oakland said, we're only there for so long. So what I asked Boston College to do, which is partially in Newton, is to house a long-term initiative to ensure that there's economic growth for all people and opportunity for all people. And I brought stakeholders around the table in addition to Boston College as well, inside the city and outside the city. And we're working on this now to begin to shape long-term goals to ensure that every single individual attains a certain income level in our city, and their children do, so that they can be successful. And I also, secondly, found some great work and research from the Brookings Institution. Two reports I'd want to mention that I took, Pathways to the Middle Class, entitled, written by Isabel Sahel, written in 2012, which has a span of a person's life, looks at different benchmarks if you hit them. A lot of these benchmarks are based on some of the research that Paul mentioned, that ensure that if you hit those benchmarks along the course of your life, you're in the middle class, 70% chance you're in the middle class. And I took some work from Boston College Center for Retirement Research at the end of a person's life to hit a benchmark there when at retirement age based on the conditions that we have in front of us. And the other report is authored by Bruce Katz in Growth of Innovation Districts and Regions. And I put that together, and I use that as a policy framework for our group. And Boston College, and I'm thankful Father Leahy has embraced hosting this. They have the resources, they have the research out and all the rest to support our effort. But I think that this model, that if we can take it and put it outside of the political system and partner and support, I think there's a better chance at sustainability over time. I think we've seen evidence of that in other communities like Providence, Worcester, and all around.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah, Linda.
So, Mayor Warren, I enjoyed hearing your story about starting your internship program. And you went from 6 to 36 in 3 years, and I expect you'll go to 360 soon after. And that really illustrates that sometimes to get to great things, you really can't be afraid to start small.
Yes.
So, but what I'd like to ask Mayor Elorza is if maybe you can share with us, you mentioned earlier you identified that there is a strong network of after-school programs in your city. And I see in your bio that you've also towards having some 12-month learning opportunities. And I know that is one strong component of the work that Paul Revell is trying to make happen here. So I wonder if you could share how that started, and did it kind of tie in with those after-school programs, or is it something different from that?
So just in case, did everyone hear that, or the question is about the after-school programs, and then I think the broader question is about lengthening the time that kids are in school. So, Mayor Lorza, why don't you start? And if others of you have views about lengthening the school year or school day.
There are a number of conversations that we're having right now around maximizing time on task, whether that's during the school day, after school, on weekends, during the summer. But the global vision is, how can we create an infrastructure of learning tools and social supports so that students can continue to learn wherever they are, whenever they are, meaning any time of day, any time of year, and any time of life. And there are a number of steps that we're taking in that direction. So for example, working with 30 community organizations, I launched the Summer of Learning campaign. And just this weekend, we had a Summer Learning Expo for the very first time, with the idea of connecting folks in the community, our students, our young people, to the opportunities that already exist. And we had somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 families come, which was just incredible. It was really energetic, and I was very excited to see so much interest in it. So there are steps that we're taking. So these small, low-hanging fruit steps that we're taking. But that's part of why I'm so interested in this initiative, because I want to think large, and I want to think big. Especially right now where we have access to so many online learning tools. How do we better integrate them into our schoolwork and / our education work so that students always have access to it? I'm very interested also in how we treat the summer. Perhaps the summer can be the 5th quarter. Perhaps we grade the summer. Perhaps we integrate the summer much more, we weave the summer in a much more integrated way into what we do in education. Perhaps also we better integrate our school departments into our departments throughout the city, because it's the exact same kids who transition at the end of the school year from our classrooms into our rec centers. Yet our rec centers and our classrooms haven't had much of any dialogue and discussion in the past. It's the exact same students who graduate from our schools that then transition into the workplace. How do we better incorporate our workforce development system and programs into our schools? So I'm very interested in having this broader conversation about thinking of this. Someone earlier mentioned the idea of lifelong learners. I think you mentioned that, Greg. Lifelong learners, and really take that the next step and think, at any time of day and at any time of year, students should have access to learning supports and to social and emotional supports that they need so they can continue to learn and grow. Because this 80-20 split, there's no way we're going to have dramatic change and achieve the very ambitious goals that we all have in only that 20% of time. But once we start thinking we have another 80% of time to work with, now your eyes light up and start thinking, all right, maybe we can get these dramatic results.
Yesterday we had a press conference announcing all of our out-of-school time activities this summer, and it's grown so much now to where before people were saying, I don't know what I'm going to do with the kids this summer, to, okay, what am I going to do now with all these choices that we have? So, but we still got to go after the kids that are coming from the families that don't value this as much. I did want to just add one thing, because we were experimenting with something called a Compassionate Schools project in our city. We're in 3 schools, elementary schools, in partnership with the Curry School of Education at UVA, we're teaching kids social and emotional coping skills, nutrition and wellness, take care of their body, and then mindfulness and meditation practices in 3 schools. And we're going to 10 schools next year, and we'll be following these kids over the course of their career. And just in 1 year, it's been amazing to see how these kids have, 2/3 of our kids are free and reduced lunch. Some of these kids are really challenged. What this Compassionate Schools project has done with these kids' in-school behavior and their ability to what I say, have open mind and open heart now. So before coming into school, just all jacked up, post-traumatic stress, to now calm and learning, and the classroom environment has changed. So if anybody's interested in that, we've got some very interesting activity going on in Louisville in that area, the Compassionate Schools Project.
You know, in Oakland, we're seeing a correlation between the number of periods in a day as well as the total hours of instruction and our ability to graduate kids eligible for our UC system, University of California system, our state university system, which is a fantastic public education system. You know, right now, my 9th grade class, only 10% of them will have a college degree by the time they're 23 years old. 10%. In this economy, that is tragic. And so, you know, I think we think about the correlation between hours and, you know, other outcomes, but just the fact that we aren't, we've structured the school day so that our kids aren't even eligible for our state university system in most of our schools. That is something we're working on correcting right away.
I'll just build upon that. We've leveraged a lot of ELT opportunities thanks to DESE. I saw Cliff Schwang here earlier for their investment. Massachusetts has made a pretty big investment in expanded learning time. We went from having 1 school to having 4 schools. But it took us some time not to make it just a kill and drill exercise. You know, acceleration academies, all the like. We've got our partners here who really make sure we're closing opportunity gaps, not just teaching more math louder and longer. And I think kids appreciate that. I think families appreciate that. And, you know, it's definitely been for us an invaluable investment and allowed us to also have the, you know, more planning and more prep time for educators, more time to have teacher voice being added to the work that we're doing. So really, really important.
Yeah, we've actually leveraged a ton of provider resources in the community, from our early childhood providers and the network and the collaborative work we've done together with those providers in Tufts University, sort of our Stellar program. We've done a lot of work with our Summer Promise program as an intervention tool to measure, as we're trying to attack the whole child, provide for the whole child, the focus on the whole child, how we connect them to the great amount of resources we have in the city, and those who are most vulnerable, and with those after school and you know, continuing ed or enrichment resources would be beneficial to them as well.
Great. Well, speaking of time, we are out of it, and I've learned not to expand time when it's around lunchtime. So, unfortunately, we're going to have to call this panel to a close. I want to thank all the mayors, Mayor Warren, Mayor Loza. And I want to thank you all, not just for being here today, but for participating in the By All Means project. I really not only appreciate your time, but I admire your vision. So thanks very much. Thanks to all of you, and we'll reconvene here at
So
2
I just
p.m.
have a couple of announcements. So if you could all look, if you have a yellow dot on your badge, we invite you over to lunch at Radcliffe Gym. We will have staff directing you over. We'll exit through the back doors. Once there, if you could also check your badge. Some of you have assigned seating. If it's not listed on your badge, it's just open seating. If you have a dietary restriction, please let your server know. Right now there will be chicken set up, but we have all of your restrictions that you've let us know about, meals available for you. So please just let them know. Sessions will resume back in here at 2 o'clock, and we invite all the mayors just to hang back. We're going to take a quick photo. And if you have any questions, let us know. So straight through these back doors.